The Lincoln-Douglas Debates, performed by David Strathern and Richard Dreyfuss, introduced by Alan C. Gelzo, and additional narration provided by Michael McConaughey.
In the year 1858, every political eye in the United States swiveled onto what would usually have been considered a minor political election in the Midwest. The senior U.S. Senator from Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas, was running for re-election to the Senate, and considering that Douglas was the most powerful politician in the Democratic Party, and maybe even in American politics itself, his re-election campaign should have gone off without a hitch. In 1850, Douglas had helped cobble together the most famous political compromise in the history of the Senate, the Compromise of 1850, which helped soothe the political turmoil over the legal enslavement of 4 million African Americans by the 15 southern states of the American Union, and the demand of Southerners for the expansion of slavery into the undeveloped territories of the American West. Then, 4 years later, Douglas was the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which laid down as the method for solving the slavery question in those territories the doctrine of popular sovereignty, that the people in the territories should be the only ones authorized to decide whether or not to legalize slavery for themselves. Douglas was riding the highest political tide of his life in 1858, and re-election to the Senate would be not only a popular affirmation of his policies towards slavery, but the high road to nomination as the Democratic Party's candidate for President of the United States in 1860. But there were dangerous currents beneath that tide for Stephen Douglas. When popular sovereignty was used as the method for settling the territorial government of Kansas in 1856, a guerrilla war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions broke out, which cast doubt on the real feasibility of popular sovereignty. A year later, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its judgment in a freedom suit filed by a slave, Dred Scott, and the majority opinion, written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, struck down the doctrine of popular sovereignty on the grounds that no Western territory could exclude slave owners and their slaves. Douglas was reduced to explaining that each territory could still exercise a kind of negative popular sovereignty by simply refusing to enact the police codes necessary to enforce legalized slavery. But this infuriated the bloc of Southern Democrats, who saw the Dred Scott decision as their guaranteed ticket to control of the territories, and of the states those territories would become when they were admitted to the Union. And it gave an opportunity for President James Buchanan, a Democrat who had his own eye on re-election in 1860, a chance to read Douglas out of the Democratic Party and warn Illinois Democrats not to send Douglas back to the Senate. With that fire lit behind him, Douglas saw less to fear from the candidate who was running against him, the nominee of the newly formed anti-slavery Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln. Although Lincoln had a distinguished record of service in the Illinois state legislature and had served a term in the lower house of Congress as a member of the Whig Party, he had no name recognition outside Illinois. In fact, Lincoln had largely withdrawn from politics after leaving Congress in 1849. During his term, he had unwisely challenged the constitutionality of President James K. Polk's war with Mexico, and he was smeared as Spotty Lincoln for demanding that Polk reveal on what spot along the border Mexicans had actually begun the war by attacking American troops. But the passage of Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act galvanized Lincoln back into political life. He had always opposed slavery. He had always believed that slavery violated the natural rights of the enslaved blacks. But he had also supposed that slavery would gradually die out on its own if it was contained within the South and not allowed to spread into the Western territories. Douglas's popular sovereignty seemed to open just that possibility, and together with the Dred Scott decision, Lincoln became convinced that a well-organized slave power had gone on the offensive and would not rest until slavery had been legalized everywhere in the United States. In 1854, Lincoln sought election to the Senate from Illinois by running against a Douglas loyalist, James Shields, and lost when anti-slavery Democrats failed to support him. In 1858, Lincoln was running again as the first and only choice of the Republicans of Illinois for the U.S. Senate, and he accepted the Republican State Convention's endorsement by picturing the American Union as a house divided, which could not permanently endure half slave and half free. With Douglas suffering from damage to his popular sovereignty doctrine, as well as from the organized hostility of his own party's leadership, it was entirely possible that an upset was in the making. But Douglas still enjoyed tremendous popularity in Illinois, and to counter that popularity, Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of one-on-one debates, which Douglas scheduled for 7 locations around the state during the late summer and early fall of 1858. What had promised to be just another political campaign now took on epic dimensions as the whole country turned to watch the spectacle of Douglas fighting to save his political life. Each debate lasted 3 hours, with each of the candidates taking turns opening with an hour-long statement of his principles, followed by the other candidate speaking in rebuttal for an hour and a half, and then the first candidate adding a half-hour rejoinder. The crowds, who turned out in parks and town squares and fairgrounds to hear the candidates, varied in number from 1,500 to over 10,000, and shorthand reporters hired by the Chicago newspapers allowed the full texts of each debate to be published all across the nation. The debates were, by turns, orderly and raucous. The air filled with the dust clouds of thousands of people on foot, on horseback, or in wagons, and punctuated by the noise of brass bands and fistfights. The weather was unbearably hot and dry until the final 3 weeks of the campaign. There was only one topic up for discussion: slavery, and whether it should be allowed any opportunity to spread into the territories. But that single topic was stippled with rhetorical fire from both candidates. Douglas argued that Lincoln had betrayed his country in the Mexican War, that popular sovereignty, even in its negative form, was the only way to settle the slavery dispute and head off civil war, that Lincoln was a radical abolitionist who wanted to free all the slaves at once, that the House divided speech was an invitation to civil conflict, that Lincoln had hatched a conspiracy of his own to radicalize members of the old Whig Party, that Lincoln, and this was explosive in a society which took white racial supremacy for granted, wanted to mix blacks and whites as political and social equals. Lincoln volleyed back that popular sovereignty was merely a trick to guarantee the nationalization of slavery, that Douglas could not hold on to popular sovereignty and the Dred Scott decision, that Douglas had ignored the most fundamental objection to slavery, that it is morally wrong. In the end, the overall voting should have handed the election to Lincoln, but the unevenness of the state's apportionment plan allowed Douglas to be reelected instead. Nevertheless, the attention Lincoln garnered through the debates made him a national star of the Republican Party, and in 1860, Lincoln would be nominated by the Republicans for the presidency. In that race, he would once more meet Stephen Douglas, now the Democratic presidential nominee, and this time Lincoln would win to become the 16th President of the United States. Over the 150 years since the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the debates have achieved an almost legendary status in American history. They are a testimony to the dazzling quality of American political oratory in the days before spin rooms and Instapundits reduced politics to sound bites. They are also a reminder that Americans take their politics seriously, even to the point of standing for 3 hours in a broiling August sun, when their politicians are willing to take them seriously. Above all, the Lincoln-Douglas debates are a reminder that democracy has to take account of more than just the right poll numbers, that democracy cannot be merely an end in itself, but must reckon with questions of moral right and wrong as well. Is democracy only about the satisfaction of popular sovereignty? Or is it about persuading the majority to choose what is naturally right? Those were the issues Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas were debating in 1858 when the subject was slavery. We are still debating those issues today. Only the subjects have changed. Alan C. Gelzo, Henry R. Luce Professor, Gettysburg College, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
First debate with Stephen A. Douglas at Ottawa, Illinois, August 21st, 1858. Mr. Douglas's speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, I appear before you today for the purpose of discussing the leading political topics which now agitate the public mind. By an arrangement between Mr. Lincoln and myself, we are present here today for the purpose of having a joint discussion as the representatives of the two great political parties of the state and union upon the principles in issue between these parties, and this vast concourse of people shows the deep feeling which pervades the public mind in regard to the questions dividing us. Prior to 1854, this country was divided into two great political parties, known as the Whig and Democratic parties. Both were national and patriotic, advocating principles that were universal in their application. An old-line Whig could proclaim his principles in Louisiana and Massachusetts alike. Whig principles had no boundary sectional line. They were not limited by the Ohio River, nor by the Potomac, nor by the line of the free and slave states, but applied and were proclaimed wherever the Constitution ruled or the American flag waved over the American soil. So it was and so it is with the great Democratic Party, which from the days of Jefferson until this period has proven itself to be the historic party of this nation. While the Whig and Democratic parties differed in regard to a bank, the tariff, distribution, the specie circular, and the sub-treasury, they agreed on the great slavery question which now agitates the Union. I say that the Whig Party and the Democratic Party agreed on this slavery question, while they differed on those matters of expediency to which I have referred. The Whig Party and the Democratic Party jointly adopted the compromise measures of 1850 as the basis of a proper and just solution of this slavery question in all its forms. Clay was the great leader with Webster on his right and Cass on his left, and sustained by the patriots in the Whig and Democratic ranks, who had devised and enacted the compromise measures of 1850. In 1851, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party united in Illinois in adopting resolutions endorsing and approving the principles of the compromise measures of 1850 as the proper adjustment of that question. In 1852, when the Whig Party assembled in convention at Baltimore for the purpose of nominating a candidate for the presidency, the first thing it did was to declare the compromise measures of 1850 in substance and in principle a suitable adjustment of that question.
Here the speaker was interrupted by loud and long continued applause.
My friends, silence will be more acceptable to me in the discussion of these questions than applause. I desire to address myself to your judgment, your understanding, and your consciences, and not to your passions or your enthusiasm. When the Democratic Convention assembled in Baltimore in the same year for the purpose of nominating a Democratic candidate for the presidency, it also adopted the compromise measures of 1850 as the basis of Democratic action. Thus, you see that up to 1853-1854, the Whig Party and the Democratic Party both stood on the same platform with regard to the slavery question. That platform was the right of the people of each state and each territory to decide their local and domestic institutions for themselves, subject only to the federal Constitution. During the session of Congress of 1853-54, I introduced into the Senate of the United States a bill to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska on that principle which had been adopted in the compromise measures of 1850, approved by the Whig Party and the Democratic Party in Illinois in 1851, and endorsed by the Whig Party and the Democratic Party in National Convention in 1852. In order that there might be no misunderstanding in relation to the principle involved in the Kansas and Nebraska bill, I put forth the true intent and meaning of the act in these words. Quote, "It is the true intent and meaning of this act not to legislate slavery into any state or territory, or to exclude it therefrom, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way, subject only to the federal Constitution," unquote. Thus you see that up to 1854, when the Kansas and Nebraska bill was brought into Congress for the purpose of carrying out the principles which both parties had up to that time endorsed and approved, there had been no division in this country in regard to that principle except the opposition of the abolitionists. In the House of Representatives of the Illinois legislature, upon a resolution asserting that principle, every Whig and every Democrat in the House voted in the affirmative, and only 4 men voted against it, and those 4 were old-line abolitionists. In 1854, Mr. Abraham Lincoln and Mr. Trumbull entered into an arrangement, one with the other and each with his respective friends, to dissolve the old Whig Party on the one hand and to dissolve the old Democratic Party on the other, and to connect the members of both into an abolition party under the name and disguise of a Republican Party. The terms of that arrangement between Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Trumbull have been published to the world by Mr. Lincoln's special friend James H. Matheny, Esquire, and they were that Lincoln should have Shields' place in the U.S. Senate, which was then about to become vacant, and that Trumbull should have my seat when my term expired. Lincoln went to work to abolitionize the old Whig Party all over the state, pretending he was then as good a Whig as ever, and Trumbull went to work in his part of the state, preaching abolitionism in its milder and lighter form, and trying to abolitionize the Democratic Party and bring old Democrats, handcuffed and bound hand and foot, into the abolition camp. In pursuance of the arrangement, the parties met at Springfield in October 1854 and proclaimed their new platform. Lincoln was to bring into the abolition camp the old-line Whigs and transfer them over to Giddings, Chase, Ford, Douglas, and Parson Lovejoy, who were ready to receive them and christen them in their new faith. They laid down on that occasion a platform for their new Republican Party, which was to be thus constructed. I have the resolutions of their state convention then held, which was the first mass state convention ever held in Illinois by the Black Republican Party, and I now hold them in my hands and will read a part of them and cause the others to be printed. Here is the most important and material resolution of this abolition platform. 1. Resolved, that we believe this truth to be self-evident, that when parties become subversive of the ends for which they are established, or incapable of restoring the government to the true principles of the Constitution, it is the right and duty of the people to dissolve the political bands by which they may have been connected therewith, and to organize new parties upon such principles and with such views as the circumstances and exigencies of the nation may demand. 2. Resolved, that the times imperatively demand the reorganization of parties, and repudiating all previous party attachments, names, and predilections, we unite ourselves together in defense of the liberty and constitution of the country, and will hereafter cooperate as the Republican Party, pledged to the accomplishment of the following purposes: to bring the administration of the government back to the control of first principles, to restore Nebraska and Kansas to the position of free territories, that as the Constitution of the United States vests in the states and not in Congress the power to legislate for the extradition of fugitives from labor, to repeal and entirely abrogate the fugitive slave law, to restrict slavery to those states in which it exists, to prohibit the admission of any more slave states into the Union, to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, to exclude slavery from all the territories over which the general government has exclusive jurisdiction, and to resist the acquirements of any more territories unless the practice of slavery therein forever shall have been prohibited. 3. Resolved, that in furtherance of these principles, we will use such constitutional and lawful means as shall seem best adapted to their accomplishment, and that we will support no man for office under the general or state government who is not positively and fully committed to the support of these principles, and whose personal character and conduct is not a guarantee that he is reliable, and who shall have not abjured old party allegiance and ties.
The resolutions, as they were read, were cheered throughout.
Now, gentlemen, your Black Republicans have cheered every one of those propositions. And yet I venture to say that you cannot get Mr. Lincoln to come out and say that he is now in favor of each one of them. That these propositions, one and all, constitute the platform of the Black Republican Party of this day, I have no doubt. And when you were not aware for what purpose I was reading them, your Black Republicans cheered them as good Black Republican doctrines. My object in reading these resolutions was to put the question to Abraham Lincoln this day whether he now stands and will stand by each article in that creed and carry it out. I desire to know whether Mr. Lincoln today stands as he did in 1854 in favor of the unconditional repeal of the fugitive slave law. I desired him to answer whether he stands pledged today, as he did in 1854, against the admission of any more slave states into the Union, even if the people want them. I want to know whether he stands pledged against the admission of a new state into the Union with such a constitution as the people of that state may see fit to make. I want to know whether he stands today pledged to the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. I desire him to answer whether he stands pledged to the prohibition of the slave trade between the different states. I desire to know whether he stands pledged to prohibit slavery in all the territories of the United States, north as well as south of the Missouri Compromise line. I desire him to answer whether he is opposed to the acquisition of any more territory unless slavery is first prohibited therein. I want his answer to these questions. Your affirmative cheers in favor of this abolition platform is not satisfactory. I ask Abraham Lincoln to answer these questions, in order that when I trot him down to Lower Egypt, I may put the same questions to him. My principles are the same everywhere. I can proclaim them alike in the North, the South, the East, and the West. My principles will apply wherever the Constitution prevails and the American flag waves. I desire to know whether Mr. Lincoln's principles will bear transplanting from Ottawa to Jonesboro. I put these questions to him today distinctly and ask for an answer. I have a right to an answer, for I quote from the platform of the Republican Party made by himself and others at the time the party was formed, and the bargain made by Lincoln to dissolve and kill the old Whig Party and transfer its members bound hand and foot to the Abolition Party under the direction of Giddings and Fred Douglass. In the remarks I have made on this platform and the position of Mr. Lincoln upon it, I mean nothing personally disrespectful or unkind to that gentleman. I have known him for nearly 25 years. There were many points of sympathy between us when we first got acquainted. We were both comparatively boys, and both struggling with poverty in a strange land. I was a school teacher in the town of Winchester, and he a flourishing grocery keeper in the town of Salem. He was more successful in his occupation than I was in mine, and hence more fortunate in this world's goods. Lincoln is one of those peculiar men who perform with admirable skill everything which they undertake. I made as good a school teacher as I could, and when a cabinet maker, I made a good bedstead and tables, although my old boss said I succeeded better with bureaus and secretaries than anything else. But I believe that Lincoln was always more successful in business than I, for his business enabled him to get into the legislature. I met him there, however, and had a sympathy with him because of the uphill struggle we both had in life. He was then just as good at telling an anecdote as now. He could beat any of the boys wrestling or running a foot race, in pitching quoits or tossing a copper, could ruin more liquor than all the boys of the town together, and the dignity and impartiality with which he presided at a horse race or fist fight excited the admiration and won the praise of everybody that was present and participated. I sympathized with him because he was struggling with difficulties, and so was I. Mr. Lincoln served with me in the legislature in 1836, when we both retired and he subsided or became submerged and was lost sight of as a public man for some years. In 1846, when Wilmot introduced his celebrated proviso and the abolition tornado swept over the country, Lincoln again turned up as a member of Congress from the Sangamon district. I was then in the Senate of the United States and was glad to welcome my old friend and companion. Whilst in Congress, he distinguished himself by his opposition to the Mexican War, taking the side of the common enemy against his own country. And when he returned home, he found that the indignation of the people followed him everywhere, and he was again submerged or obliged to retire into private life. forgotten by his former friends. He came up again in 1854, just in time to make this abolition or Black Republican platform in company with Giddings, Lovejoy, Chase, and Fred Douglass for the Republican Party to stand upon. Trumbull, too, was one of our own contemporaries. He was born and raised in Old Connecticut, was bred a Federalist, but removing to Georgia turned nullifier when nullification was popular, and as soon as he disposed of his clocks and wound up his business, migrated to Illinois, turned politician and lawyer here, and made his appearance in 1841 as a member of the legislature. He became noted as the author of the scheme to repudiate a large portion of the state debt of Illinois, which, if successful, would have brought infamy and disgrace upon the fair escutcheon of our glorious state. The odium attached to that measure consigned him to oblivion for a time. I helped to do it. I walked into a public meeting in the hall of the House of Representatives and replied to his repudiating speeches, and resolutions were carried over his head denouncing repudiation and asserting the moral and legal obligation of Illinois to pay every dollar of the debt she owed and every bond that bore her seal. Trumbull's malignity has followed me since I thus defeated his infamous scheme. These two men, having formed this combination to abolitionize the old Whig Party and the old Democratic Party, and put themselves into the Senate of the United States in pursuance of their bargain, are now carrying out that arrangement. Matheny states that Trumbull broke faith, that the bargain was that Lincoln should be the senator in Shields' place, and Trumbull was to wait for mine. And the story goes that Trumbull cheated Lincoln, having control of 4 or 5 abolitionized Democrats who were holding over in the Senate. He would not let them vote for Lincoln, and which obliged the rest of the abolitionists to support him in order to secure an abolition senator. There are a number of authorities for the truth of this besides Matheny, and I suppose that even Mr. Lincoln will not deny it. Mr. Lincoln demands that he shall have the place intended for Trumbull, as Trumbull cheated him and got his, and Trumbull is stumping the state, traducing me for the purpose of securing that position for Lincoln in order to quiet him. It was in consequence of this arrangement that the Republican convention was impaneled to instruct for Lincoln and nobody else, and it was on this account that they passed resolutions that he was their first, their last, and their only choice. Archie Williams was nowhere. Browning was nobody. Wentworth was not to be considered. They had no man in the Republican Party for the place except Lincoln, for the reason that he demanded that they should carry out the arrangement. Having formed this new party for the benefit of deserters from Whiggery and deserters from democracy, and having laid down the abolition platform which I have read, Lincoln now takes his stand and proclaims his abolition doctrines. Let me read a part of them. In his speech at Springfield to the convention which nominated him for the Senate, he said, "In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south.
From the crowd came, "Good, good," and cheers.
I am delighted to hear you black Republicans say good. I have no doubt that doctrine expresses your sentiments. And I will prove to you now, if you will listen to me, that it is revolutionary and destructive of the existence of this government. Mr. Lincoln, in the extract from which I have read, says that this government cannot endure permanently in the same condition in which it was made by its framers, divided into free and slave states. He says that it has existed for about 70 years thus divided, and yet he tells you that it cannot endure permanently on the same principles and in the same relative condition in which our fathers made it. Why can it not exist divided into free and slave states? Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, Jay, and the great men of that day made this government divided into free states and slave states, and left each state perfectly free to do as it pleased on the subject of slavery. Why can it not exist on the same principles on which our fathers made it? They knew when they framed the Constitution that in a country as wide and broad as this, with such a variety of climate, production, and interest, the people necessarily required different laws and institutions in different localities. They knew that the laws and regulations which would suit the granite hills of New Hampshire would be unsuited to the rice plantations of South Carolina, and they therefore provided that each state should retain its own legislature and its own sovereignty, with the full and complete power to do as it pleased within its own limits, in all that was local and not national. One of the reserved rights of the states was the right to regulate the relations between master and servant on the slavery question. At the time the Constitution was formed, there were 13 states in the Union, 12 of which were slaveholding states, and one a free state. Suppose this doctrine of uniformity preached by Mr. Lincoln, that the states should all be free or all be slave, had prevailed, and what would have been the result? Of course, the 12 slaveholding states would have overruled the one free state, and slavery would have been fastened by a constitutional provision on every inch of the American Republic, instead of being left as our fathers wisely left it, to each state to decide for itself. Here I assert that uniformity in the local laws and institutions of the different states is neither possible or desirable. If uniformity had been adopted when the government was established, it must inevitably have been the uniformity of slavery everywhere, or else the uniformity of Negro citizenship and Negro equality everywhere. We are told by Lincoln that he is utterly opposed to the Dred Scott decision and will not submit to it, for the reason that he says it deprives the Negro of the rights and privileges of citizenship. That is the first and main reason which he assigns for his warfare on the Supreme Court of the United States and its decision. I ask you, are you in favor of conferring upon the Negro the rights and privileges of citizenship? Do you desire to strike out of our state constitution that clause which keeps slaves and free Negroes out of the state and allow the free Negroes to flow in and cover your prairies with black settlements? Do you desire to turn this beautiful state into a free Negro colony in order that when Missouri abolishes slavery, she can send 100,000 emancipated slaves into Illinois to become citizens and voters on an equality with yourselves? If you desire Negro citizenship, if you desire to allow them to come into the state and settle with the white man, if you desire them to vote on an equality with yourselves and to make them eligible to office, to serve on juries, and to adjudge your rights, then support Mr. Lincoln and the Black Republican Party who are in favor of the citizenship of the Negro. For one, I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. I believe this government was made on the white basis. I believe it was made by white men, for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever. And I am in favor of confining citizenship to white men, men of European birth and descent, instead of conferring it upon Negroes, Indians, and other inferior races.
From the crowd came, "Good for you," and "Douglas forever."
Mr. Lincoln, following the example and lead of all the little abolition orators who go around and lecture in the basements of schools and churches, reads from the Declaration of Independence that all men were created equal, and then asks, how can you deprive a Negro of that equality which God and the Declaration of Independence awards to him? He and they maintain that Negro equality is guaranteed by the laws of God, and that it is asserted in the Declaration of Independence. If they think so, of course they have a right to say so, and so vote. I do not question Mr. Lincoln's conscientious belief that the Negro was made his equal, and hence is his brother. But for my own part, I do not regard the Negro as my equal, and positively deny that he is my brother, or any kin to me whatsoever. Lincoln has evidently learned by heart Parson Lovejoy's catechism. He can repeat it as well as Farnsworth, and he is worthy of a medal from Father Giddings and Fred Douglass for his abolitionism. He holds that the Negro was born his equal and yours, and that he was endowed with equality by the Almighty, and that no human law can deprive him of these rights which were guaranteed to him by the supreme ruler of the universe. Now, I do not believe that the Almighty ever intended the Negro to be the equal of the white man. If he did, he's been a long time demonstrating the fact. For thousands of years, the Negro has been a race upon the earth, and during all that time, in all latitudes and climates, wherever he has wandered or been taken, he has been inferior to the race which he has there met. He belongs to an inferior race, and must always occupy an inferior position. I do not hold that because the Negro is our inferior, that therefore he ought to be a slave. By no means can such a conclusion be drawn from what I have said. On the contrary, I hold that humanity and Christianity both require that the Negro shall have and enjoy every right, every privilege, and every immunity consistent with the safety of the society in which he lives. On that point, I presume, there can be no diversity of opinion. You and I are bound to extend to our inferior and dependent being every right, every privilege, every facility and immunity consistent with the public good. The question then arises, what rights and privileges are consistent with the public good? This is a question which each state and each territory must decide for itself. Illinois has decided it for herself. We have provided that the Negro shall not be a slave, and we have also provided that he shall not be a citizen, but protect him in his civil rights, in his life, his person, and his property, only depriving him of all political rights whatsoever, and refusing to put him on an equality with the white man. That policy of Illinois is satisfactory to the Democratic Party and to me. And if it were to the Republicans, there would then be no question upon the subject. But the Republicans say that he ought to be made a citizen. And when he becomes a citizen, he becomes your equal with all your rights and privileges. They assert the Dred Scott decision to be monstrous because it denies that the Negro is or can be a citizen under the Constitution. Now, I hold that Illinois had a right to abolish and prohibit slavery as she did, and I hold that Kentucky has the same right to continue and protect slavery that Illinois had to abolish it. I hold that New York had as much right to abolish slavery as Virginia has to continue it, and that each and every state of this union is a sovereign power with the right to do as it pleases upon this question of slavery and upon all its domestic institutions. Slavery is not the only question which comes up in this controversy. There is a far more important one to you, and that is, what shall be done with the free Negro? We have settled the slavery question as far as we are concerned. We have prohibited it in Illinois forever, and in doing so I think we have done wisely. And there is no man in the state who would be more strenuous in his opposition to the introduction of slavery than I would. But when we settled it for ourselves, we exhausted all our power over that subject. We have done our whole duty and can do no more. We must leave each and every other state to decide for itself the same question. In relation to the policy to be pursued toward the free Negroes, we have said that they shall not vote, whilst Maine, on the other hand, has said they shall vote. Maine is a sovereign state and has the power to regulate the qualifications of voters within her limits. I would never consent to confer the right of voting and of citizenship upon a Negro, but still, I am not going to quarrel with Maine for differing from me in opinion. Let Maine take care of her own Negroes and fix the qualifications of her own voters to suit herself, without interfering with Illinois, and Illinois will not interfere with Maine. So with the state of New York. She allows the Negro to vote, provided he owns $250 worth of property, but not otherwise. While I would not make any distinction whatever between a Negro who held property and one who did not. Yet if the sovereign state of New York chooses to make that distinction, it is her business and not mine, and I will not quarrel with her for it. She can do as she pleases on this question if she minds her own business, and we will do the same. Now, my friends, if we will only act conscientiously and rigidly upon this great principle of popular sovereignty, which guarantees to each state and territory the right to do as it pleases on all things local and domestic, instead of Congress interfering, we will continue at peace, one with another. Why should Illinois be at war with Missouri, or Kentucky with Ohio, or Virginia with New York, merely because their institutions differ? Our fathers intended that our institutions should differ. They knew that the North and the South, having different climates, productions, and interests, required different institutions. This doctrine of Mr. Lincoln's, of uniformity among the institutions of the different states, is a new doctrine never dreamed of by Washington, Madison, or the framers of this government. Mr. Lincoln and the Republican Party set themselves up as wiser than these men who made this government, which has flourished for 70 years under the principle of popular sovereignty, recognizing the right of each state to do as it pleased. Under that principle, we have grown from a nation of 3 or 4 millions to a nation of about 30 millions of people. We have crossed the Allegheny Mountains and filled up the whole Northwest, turning the prairie into a garden, and building up churches and schools, thus spreading civilization and Christianity where before there was nothing but savage barbarism. Under that principle, we have become from a feeble nation the most powerful on the face of the earth. And if we only adhere to that principle, we can go forward, increasing in territory, in power, in strength, and in glory, until the Republic of America shall be the North Star that shall guide the friends of freedom throughout the civilized world. And why can we not adhere to that great principle of self-government upon which our institutions were originally based? I believe that this new doctrine preached by Mr. Lincoln and his party will dissolve the Union if it succeeds. They are trying to array all the northern states in one body against the South, to excite a sectional war between the free states and the slave states in order that the one or the other may be driven to the wall. I'm told that my time is out. Mr. Lincoln will now address you for an hour and a half, and I will then occupy a half hour in replying to him.
3 times, 3 cheers were here given for Douglas. Mr. Lincoln's reply. Mr. Lincoln then came forward and was greeted with loud and protracted cheers from fully 2/3 of the audience. This was admitted by the Douglas men on the platform. It was some minutes before he could make himself heard, even by those on the stand. At last he said,
"My fellow citizens, when a man hears himself somewhat misrepresented, it provokes him. At least I find it so with myself. But when the misrepresentation becomes very gross and palpable, it is more apt to amuse him. The first thing I see fit to notice is the fact that Judge Douglas alleges, after running through the history of the old Democratic and the old Whig parties, that Judge Trumbull and myself made an arrangement in 1854 by which I was to have the place of General Shields in the United States Senate, and Judge Trumbull was to have the place of Judge Douglas. Now, all I have to say upon that subject is that I think no man, not even Judge Douglas, can prove it, because it is not true. I have no doubt he is conscientious in saying it. As to those resolutions that he took such a length of time to read, as being the platform of the Republican Party in 1854, I say I never had anything to do with them, and I think Trumbull never had. Judge Douglas cannot show that either one of us ever did have anything to do with them. I believe this is true about those resolutions. There was a call for a convention to form a Republican Party at Springfield, and I think that my friend Mr. Lovejoy, who is here upon this stand, had a hand in it. I think this is true. And I think if he will remember accurately, he will be able to recollect that he tried to get me into it, and I would not go in. I believe it is also true that I went away from Springfield when the convention was in session, to attend court in Tazewell County. It is true they did place my name, though without authority, upon the committee, and afterwards wrote me to attend the meeting of the committee, but I refused to do so, and I never had anything to do with that organization. This is the plain truth about all that matter of the resolutions. Now, about this story that Judge Douglas tells of Trumbull bargaining to sell out the old Democratic Party and Lincoln agreeing to sell out the old Whig Party. I have the means of knowing about that. Judge Douglas cannot have, and I know there is no substance to it whatever. Yet I have no doubt he is conscientious about it. I know that after Mr. Lovejoy got into the legislature that winter, he complained of me that I had told all the old Whigs in his district that the old Whig Party was good enough for them, and some of them voted against him because I told them so. Now, I have no means of totally disproving such charges as this which the judge makes. A man cannot prove a negative, but he has a right to claim that when a man makes an affirmative charge, he must offer some proof to show the truth of what he says. I certainly cannot introduce testimony to show the negative about things, but I have a right to claim that if a man says he knows a thing, then he must show how he knows it. I always have a right to claim this, and it is not satisfactory to me that he may be conscientious on the subject.
Here there were cheers and laughter.
Now, gentlemen, I hate to waste my time on such things, but in regard to that general abolition tilt that Judge Douglas makes, when he says that I was engaged at that time in selling out and abolitionizing the old Whig Party, I hope you will permit me to read a part of a printed speech I made then at Peoria, which will show altogether a different view of the position I took in that contest of 1854.
A voice from the crowd said, "Put on your specs."
Yes, sir, I am obliged to do so. I am no longer a young man. This is the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. The foregoing history may not be precisely accurate in every particular, but I am sure it is sufficiently so for all the uses I shall attempt to make of it. And in it, we have before us the chief materials enabling us to correctly judge whether the repeal of the Missouri Compromise is right or wrong. I think, and shall try to show, that it is wrong. Wrong in its direct effect, letting slavery into Kansas and Nebraska, and wrong in its prospective principle, allowing it to spread to every other part of the wide world where men can be found inclined to take it. This declared indifference, but as I must think covert real zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. Before proceeding, let me say I think I have no prejudice against the Southern people. They are just what we would be in their situation. If slavery did not now exist amongst them, they would not introduce it. If it did now exist amongst us, we should not instantly give it up. This I believe of the masses North and South. Doubtless there are individuals on both sides who would not hold slaves under any circumstances, and others who would gladly introduce slavery anew, if it were out of existence. We know that some Southern men do free their slaves, go north and become tip-top abolitionists, while some Northern ones go south and become most cruel slave masters. When Southern people tell us they are no more responsible for the origin of slavery than we, I acknowledge the fact. When it is said that the institution exists, and that it is very difficult to get rid of it in any satisfactory way, I can understand and appreciate the saying. I surely will not blame them for not doing what I should not know how to do myself. If all earthly power were given me, I should not know what to do as to the existing institution. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land. But a moment's reflection would convince me that whatever of high hope, as I think there may be in this, in the long run, its sudden execution is impossible. If they were all landed there in a day, they would all perish in the next 10 days. And there are not surplus shipping and surplus money enough in the world to carry them there in many times 10 days. What then? Free them all and keep them among us as underlings? Is it quite certain that this betters their condition? I think I would not hold one in slavery at any rate. Yet the point is not clear enough to me to denounce people upon. What next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of white people will not. Whether this feeling accords with justice and sound judgment is not the sole question, if indeed it is any part of it. A universal feeling, whether well or ill-founded, cannot be safely disregarded. We cannot, then, make them equals. It does seem to me that systems of gradual emancipation might be adopted, but for their tardiness in this, I will not undertake to judge our brethren of the South. When they remind us of their constitutional rights, I acknowledge them, not grudgingly, but fully and fairly, and I would give them any legislation for the reclaiming of their fugitives, which should not, in its stringency, be more likely to carry a free man into slavery than our ordinary criminal laws are to hang an innocent one. But all this, to my judgment, furnishes no more excuse for permitting slavery to go into our own free territory than it would for reviving the African slave trade by law. The law which forbids the bringing of slaves from Africa, and that which has so long forbid the taking of them to Nebraska, can hardly be distinguished on any moral principle, and the repeal of the former could find quite as plausible excuses as that of the latter. I have reason to know that Judge Douglas knows that I said this. I think he has the answer here to one of the questions he put to me. I do not mean to allow him to catechize me unless he pays back for it in kind. I will not answer questions one after another unless he reciprocates. But as he has made this inquiry, and I have answered it before, he has got it without my getting anything in return. He has got my answer on the fugitive slave law. Now, gentlemen, I don't want to read at any greater length, but this is the true complexion of all I have ever said in regard to the institution of slavery and the black race. This is the whole of it. And anything that argues me into his idea of perfect social and political equality with the Negro is but a specious and fantastic arrangement of words, by which a man can prove a horse chestnut to be a chestnut horse. I will say here, while upon this subject, that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. I have no purpose to introduce political and social equality between the white and the black races. There is a physical difference between the two which, in my judgment, will probably forever forbid their living together upon the footing of perfect equality. And inasmuch as it becomes a necessity that there must be a difference, I, as well as Judge Douglas, am in favor of the race to which I belong, having the superior position. I have never said anything to the contrary, but I hold that notwithstanding all this, there is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I hold that he is as much entitled to these as the white man. I agree with Judge Douglas he is not my equal in many respects, certainly not in color, perhaps not in moral or intellectual endowment, but in the right to eat the bread without leave of anybody else which his own hand earns. He is my equal, and the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every living man.
There was great applause.
Now I pass on to consider one or two more of these little follies. The judge is woefully at fault about his early friend Lincoln being a grocery keeper. I don't know as it would be a great sin if I had been, but he is mistaken. Lincoln never kept a grocery anywhere in the world. It is true that Lincoln did work the latter part of one winter in a small still house up at the head of a hollow. And so, I think my friend the judge is equally at fault when he charges me at the time when I was in Congress of having opposed our soldiers who were fighting in the Mexican War. The judge did not make his charge very distinctly, but I can tell you what he can prove by referring to the record. You remember I was an old Whig, and whenever the Democratic Party tried to get me to vote that the war had been righteously begun by the President, I would not do it. But whenever they asked for any money, or land warrants, or anything to pay the soldiers there, during all that time I gave the same votes that Judge Douglas did. You can think as you please as to whether that was consistent. Such is the truth, and the judge has the right to make all he can out of it. But when he, by a general charge, conveys the idea that I withheld supplies from the soldiers who were fighting in the Mexican War, or did anything else to hinder the soldiers, he is, to say the least, grossly and altogether mistaken, as a consultation of the records will prove to him. As I have not used up so much of my time as I had supposed, I will dwell a little longer upon one or two of these minor topics upon which the judge has spoken. He has read from my speech in Springfield, in which I say that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Does the judge say it can stand? I don't know whether he does or not. The judge does not seem to be attending to me just now, but I would like to know if it is his opinion that a house divided against itself can stand. If he does, then there is a question of veracity, not between him and me, but between the judge and an authority of a somewhat higher character.
Here there was laughter and applause.
Now, my friends, I ask your attention to this matter for the purpose of saying something seriously. I know that the judge may readily enough agree with me that the maxim which was put forth by the Savior is true. But he may allege that I misapply it, and the judge has a right to urge that, in my application, I do misapply it. And then, I have a right to show that I do not misapply it. When he undertakes to say that because I think this nation, so far as the question of slavery is concerned, will all become one thing or all the other, I am in favor of bringing about a dead uniformity in the various states in all their institutions, he argues erroneously. The great variety of the local institutions in the states, springing from differences in the soil, differences in the face of the country, and in the climate, are bonds of union. They do not make a house divided against itself, but they make a house united. If they produce in one section of the country what is called for by the wants of another section, and this other section can supply the wants of the first, They are not matters of discord, but bonds of union, true bonds of union. But can this question of slavery be considered as among these varieties in the institutions of the country? I leave it to you to say whether, in the history of our government, this institution of slavery has not always failed to be a bond of union, and, on the contrary, been an apple of discord and an element of division in the House.
From the crowd there were cries of "Yes, yes," and applause.
I ask you to consider whether, so long as the moral constitution of men's minds shall continue to be the same, after this generation and assemblage shall sink into the grave, and another race shall arise, with the same moral and intellectual development we have, whether if that institution is standing in the same irritating position in which it now is, it will not continue an element of division. If so, then I have a right to say that in regard to this question, the Union is a house divided against itself. And when the judge reminds me that I have often said to him that the institution of slavery has existed for 80 years in some states, and yet it does not exist in some others, I agree to the fact, and I account for it by looking at the position in which our fathers originally placed it, restricting it from the new territories where it had not gone, and legislating to cut off its source by the abrogation of the slave trade, thus putting the seal of legislation against its spread. The public mind did rest in the belief that it was in the course of ultimate extinction. But lately, I think, and in this I charge nothing on the judge's motives, lately I think that he, and those acting with him, have placed that institution on a new basis, which looks to the perpetuity and nationalization of slavery. And while it is placed upon this new basis, I say, and I have said, that I believe we shall not have peace upon the question until the opponents of slavery arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction. Or, on the other hand, that its advocates will push it forward until it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Now I believe, if we could arrest the spread and place it where Washington and Jefferson and Madison placed it, it would be in the course of ultimate extinction. And the public mind would, as for 80 years past, believe that it was in the course of ultimate extinction. The crisis would be past, and the institution might be let alone for 100 years, if it should live so long in the states where it exists. Yet it would be going out of existence in the way best for both the black and the white races.
Here there was great cheering. Then a voice from the crowd said, "Then do you repudiate popular sovereignty?"
Well, then, let us talk about popular sovereignty. What is popular sovereignty? Is it the right of the people to have slavery or not have it as they see fit in the territories? I will state, and I have an able man to watch me, my understanding is that popular sovereignty, as now applied to the question of slavery, does allow the people of a territory to have slavery if they want to, but does not allow them to not have it if they do not want it. I do not mean that if this vast concourse of people were in a territory of the United States, any one of them would be obliged to have a slave if he did not want one. But I do say that as I understand the Dred Scott decision, if any one man wants slaves, all the rest have no way of keeping that one man from holding them. When I made my speech at Springfield, of which the judge complains, and from which he quotes, I really was not thinking of the things which he ascribes to me at all. I had no thought in the world that I was doing anything to bring about a war between the free and the slave states. I had no thought in the world that I was doing anything to bring about a political and social equality of the black and white races. It never occurred to me that I was doing anything or favoring anything to reduce to a dead uniformity all the local institutions of the various states. But I must say, in all fairness to him, if he thinks I am doing something which leads to these bad results, it is none the better that I did not mean it. It is just as fatal to the country if I have any influence in producing it, whether I intend it or not. But can it be true that placing this institution upon the original basis, the basis upon which our fathers placed it, can have any tendency to set the northern and the southern states at war with one another? Or that it can have any tendency to make the people of Vermont raise sugar cane because they raise it in Louisiana? Or that it can compel the people of Illinois to cut pine logs on the Grand Prairie, where they will not grow, because they cut pine logs in Maine, where they do grow? The judge says this is a new principle started in regard to this question. Does the judge claim that he is working on the plan of the founders of government? I think he says in some of his speeches, indeed I have one here now, that he saw evidence of a policy to allow slavery to be south of a certain line, while north of it should be excluded, and he saw an indisposition on the part of the country to stand upon that policy. And therefore, he set about studying the subject upon original principles. And upon original principles, he got up the Nebraska bill. I am fighting it upon these original principles, fighting it in the Jeffersonian, Washingtonian, and Madisonian fashion.
There was laughter and applause.
Now, my friends, I wish you to attend for a little while to one or two other things in that Springfield speech. My main object was to show, so far as my humble ability was capable of showing to the people of this country, what I believed was the truth. That there was a tendency, if not a conspiracy, among those who have engineered this slavery question for the last 4 or 5 years, to make slavery perpetual and universal in this nation. Having made that speech principally for that object, after arranging the evidences that I thought tended to prove my proposition, I concluded with this bit of comment. We cannot absolutely know that these exact adaptations are the result of pre-concert. But when we see a lot of framed timbers, different portions of which we know have been gotten out at different times and places, and by different workmen, Stephen, Franklin, Roger, and James, for instance, and when we see these timbers joined together, and see they exactly make the frame of a house or a mill, all the tenons and mortises exactly fitting, and all the lengths and proportions of the different pieces exactly adapted to their respective places, and not a piece too many or too few, not omitting even the scaffolding, or if a single piece be lacking, we see the place in the frame exactly fitted and prepared yet to bring such piece in. In such a case, we feel it impossible not to believe that Stephen and Franklin and Roger and James all understood one another from the beginning, and all worked upon a common plan or draft drawn before the first blow was struck. When my friend Judge Douglas came to Chicago on the 9th of July, this speech having been delivered on the 16th of June, he made an harangue there in which he took hold of this speech of mine, showing that he had carefully read it. And while he paid no attention to this matter at all, but complimented me as being a kind, amiable, and intelligent gentleman, notwithstanding I had said this, he goes on and eliminates, or draws out from my speech, this tendency of mine to set the states at war with one another, to make all the institutions uniform, and set the niggers and white people to marrying together.
There was laughter.
Then, as the judge had complimented me with these pleasant titles, I must confess to my weakness, I was a little taken, for it came from a great man. I was not very much accustomed to flattery, and it came the sweeter to me. I was rather like the Hoosier with the gingerbread, when he said he reckoned he loved it better than any other man, and got less of it. As the judge had so flattered me, I could not make up my mind that he meant to deal unfairly with me. So I went to work to show him that he misunderstood the whole scope of my speech, and that I really never intended to set the people at war with one another. As an illustration, the next time I met him, which was at Springfield, I used this expression, that I claimed no right under the Constitution, nor had I any inclination, to enter into the slave states and interfere with the institutions of slavery. He says upon that, Lincoln will not enter into the slave states, but will go to the banks of the Ohio on this side and shoot over. He runs on step by step in the horse-chestnut style of argument, until, in the Springfield speech, he says, unless he shall be successful in firing his batteries until he shall have extinguished slavery in all the states, the Union shall be dissolved. Now, I don't think that was exactly the way to treat a kind, amiable, intelligent gentleman. I know if I had asked the judge to show when or where it was I had said that, if I didn't succeed in firing into the slave states until slavery should be extinguished, the Union should be dissolved, he could not have shown it. I understand what he would do. He would say, I don't mean to quote from you, but this was the result of what you say. But I have the right to ask, and I do ask now. Did you not put it in such a form that an ordinary reader or listener would take it as an expression from me? In a speech at Springfield on the night of the 17th, I thought I might as well attend to my own business a little, and I recalled his attention, as well as I could, to this charge of conspiracy to nationalize slavery. I called his attention to the fact that he had acknowledged, in my hearing twice, that he had carefully read the speech, and, in the language of the lawyers, as he had twice read the speech, and still had put in no plea or answer, I took a default on him. I insisted that I had a right, then, to renew that charge of conspiracy. 10 days afterwards, I met the judge at Clinton. That is to say, I was on the ground, but not in the discussion, and heard him make a speech. Then he comes in with his plea to this charge for the first time, and his plea, when put in, as well as I can recollect it, amounted to this: that he never had any talk with Judge Taney or the President of the United States with regard to the Dred Scott decision before it was made. I ought to know that the man who makes a charge without knowing it to be true falsifies as much as he who knowingly tells a falsehood. And lastly, that he would pronounce the whole thing a falsehood, but he would make no personal application of the charge of falsehood, not because of any regard for the kind, amiable, intelligent gentleman, but because of his own personal self-respect. I have understood since then, but will not hold the judge to it if he is not willing, that he has broken through the self-respect and has got to saying the thing out. The judge nods to me that it is so. It is fortunate for me that I can keep as good-humored as I do, when the judge acknowledges that he has been trying to make a question of veracity with me. I know the judge is a great man, while I am only a small man, but I feel that I have got him.
There was tremendous cheering.
I demur to that plea. I waive all objections that it was not filed till after default was taken, and demur to it upon the merits. What if Judge Douglas never did talk with Chief Justice Taney and the President before the Dred Scott decision was made? Does it follow that he could not have had as perfect an understanding without talking as with it? I am not disposed to stand upon my legal advantage. I am disposed to take his denial as being like an answer in chancery that he neither had any knowledge, information, or belief in the existence of such a conspiracy. I am disposed to take his answer as being as broad as though he had put it in these words. And now, I ask, even if he has done so, have not I a right to prove it on him, and to offer the evidence of more than 2 witnesses by whom to prove it? And if the evidence proves the existence of the conspiracy, does his broad answer denying all knowledge, information, or belief disturb the fact? It can only show that he was used by conspirators and was not a leader of them. Now, in regard to his reminding me of the moral rule that persons who tell what they do not know to be true falsify as much as those who knowingly tell falsehoods. I remember the rule, and it must be borne in mind that in what I have read to you, I do not say that I know such a conspiracy to exist. To that, I reply, I believe it. If the judge says that I do not believe it, then he says what he does not know, and falls within his own rule, that he who asserts a thing which he does not know to be true falsifies as much as he who knowingly tells a falsehood. I want to call your attention to a little discussion on that branch of the case, and the evidence which brought my mind to the conclusion which I expressed as my belief. If, in arraying that evidence, I had stated anything which was false or erroneous, it needed but that Judge Douglas should point it out, and I would have taken it back with all the kindness in the world. I do not deal in that way. If I have brought forward anything not a fact, if he will point it out, it will not even ruffle me to take it back. But if he will not point out anything erroneous in the evidence, is it not rather for him to show, by a comparison of the evidence, that I have reasoned falsely, than to call the kind, amiable, intelligent gentleman a liar? If I have reasoned to a false conclusion, it is the vocation of an able debater to show by argument that I have wandered to an erroneous conclusion. I want to ask your attention to a portion of the Nebraska bill, which Judge Douglas has quoted, "It being the true intent and meaning of this act, not to legislate slavery into any territory or state, nor to exclude it therefrom, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way, subject only to the Constitution of the United States." Thereupon, Judge Douglas and others began to argue in favor of popular sovereignty, the right of the people to have slaves if they wanted them, and to exclude slavery if they did not want them. "But," said in substance a senator from Ohio, Mr. Chase, I believe, "we more than suspect that you do not mean to allow the people to exclude slavery if they wish to. And if you do mean it, accept an amendment which I propose expressly authorizing the people to exclude slavery." I believe I have the amendment here before me which was offered, and under which the people of the territory, through their proper representatives, might, if they saw fit, prohibit the existence of slavery therein. And now I state it as a fact, to be taken back, if there is any mistake about it, that Judge Douglas and those acting with him voted that amendment down.
There was tremendous applause.
I now think that those men who voted it down had a real reason for doing so. They know what that reason was. It looks to us, since we have seen the Dred Scott decision pronounced, holding that, under the Constitution, the people cannot exclude slavery, I say it looks to outsiders, poor, simple, amiable, intelligent gentlemen, as though the niche was left as a place to put that Dred Scott decision in, a niche which would have been spoiled by adopting the amendment. And now I say again, if this was not the reason, it will avail the judge much more to calmly and good-humoredly point out to these people what that other reason was for voting the amendment down than swelling himself up to vociferate that he may be provoked to call somebody a liar.
Again, there was tremendous applause from the crowd.
Again, there is in that same quotation from the Nebraska bill this clause: "It being the true intent and meaning of this bill not to legislate slavery into any territory or state." I have always been puzzled to know what business the word state had in that connection. Judge Douglas knows. He put it there. He knows what he put it there for. We outsiders cannot say what he put it there for. The law they were passing was not about states, and was not about making provisions for states. What was it placed there for? After seeing the Dred Scott decision, which holds that the people cannot exclude slavery from a territory, if another Dred Scott decision shall come, holding that they cannot exclude it from a state, we shall discover that when the word was originally put there, it was in view of something which was to come in due time. We shall see that it was the other half of something. I now say again, if there is any different reason for putting it there, Judge Douglas, in a good-humored way, without calling anybody a liar, can tell what the reason was.
There were renewed cheers.
When the judge spoke at Clinton, he came very near making a charge of falsehood against me. He used, as I found it printed in a newspaper which I remember was very nearly like the real speech, the following language. I did not answer the charge of conspiracy before, for the reason that I did not suppose there was a man in America with a heart so corrupt as to believe such a charge could be true. I have too much respect for Mr. Lincoln to suppose he is serious in making the charge. I confess this is a rather curious view, that out of respect for me he should consider I was making what I deemed rather a grave charge in fun. I confess it strikes me rather strangely, but I let it pass. As the judge did not for a moment believe that there was a man in America whose heart was so corrupt as to make such a charge, and as he places me among the men in America who have hearts base enough to make such a charge, I hope he will excuse me if I hunt out another charge very like this. And if it should turn out that in hunting I should find that other, and it should turn out to be Judge Douglas himself who made it, I hope he will reconsider this question of the deep corruption of heart he has thought fit to ascribe to me. In Judge Douglas's speech of March 22, 1858, which I hold in my hand, he says, "In this connection there is another topic to which I desire to allude. I seldom refer to the course of newspapers, or notice the articles which they publish in regard to myself, but the course of the Washington Union has been so extraordinary for the last 2 or 3 months that I think it well enough to make some allusion to it. It has read me out of the Democratic Party every other day, at least for 2 or 3 months, and keeps reading me out. And, as if it had not succeeded, still continues to read me out, using such terms as traitor, renegade, deserter, and other kind and polite epithets of that nature. Sir, I have no vindication to make of my democracy against the Washington Union or any other newspapers. I am willing to allow my history and action for the last 20 years to speak for themselves as to my political principles and my fidelity to political obligations. The Washington Union has a personal grievance. When its editor was nominated for public printer, I declined to vote for him, and stated that at some time I might give my reasons for doing so. Since I declined to give that vote, this scurrilous abuse, these vindictive and constant attacks, have been repeated almost daily on me. Will my friend from Michigan read the article to which I allude? This is a part of the speech. You must excuse me from reading the entire article of the Washington Union, as Mr. Stewart read it for Mr. Douglas. The judge goes on and sums up, as I think, correctly. Mr. President, you here find several distinct propositions advanced boldly by the Washington Union editorially and apparently authoritatively, and every man who questions any of them is denounced as an abolitionist, a free soiler, a fanatic. The propositions are, first, that the primary object of all government at its original institution is the protection of person and property. Second, that the Constitution of the United States declares that the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. and that, therefore, thirdly, all state laws, whether organic or otherwise, which prohibit the citizens of one state from settling in another with their slave property, and especially declaring it forfeited, are direct violations of the original intention of the government and Constitution of the United States. And fourth, that the emancipation of the slaves of the northern states was a gross outrage on the rights of property, inasmuch as it was involuntarily done on the part of the owner. Remember that this article was published in the Union on the 17th of November, and on the 18th appeared the first article giving the adhesion of the Union to the Lecompton Constitution. It was in these words: Kansas and her Constitution. The vexed question is settled. The problem is solved. The dread point of danger is past. All serious trouble to Kansas affairs is over and gone. And a column nearly of the same sort. Then, when you come to look into the Lecompton Constitution, you find the same doctrine incorporated in it which was put forth editorially in the Union. What is it? Article 7, Section 1. The right of property is before and higher than any constitutional sanction, and the right of the owner of a slave to such slave, and its increase, is the same and as inviolable as the right of the owner of any property whatever. Then, in the schedule, is a provision that the Constitution may be amended after 1864 by a two-thirds vote. But no alteration shall be made to affect the right of property in the ownership of slaves. It will be seen by these clauses in the Lecompton Constitution that they are identical in spirit with this authoritative article in the Washington Union of the day previous to its endorsement of this Constitution. I pass over some portions of the speech, and I hope that anyone who feels interested in this matter will read the entire section of the speech and see whether I do the judge injustice. He proceeds. When I saw that article in the Union of the 17th of November, followed by the glorification of the Lecompton Constitution on the 18th of November, and this clause in the Constitution asserting the doctrine that a state has no right to prohibit slavery within its limits, I saw that there was a fatal blow being struck at the sovereignty of the states of this Union. I stop the quotation there, again requesting that it may all be read. I have read all of the portion I desire to comment upon. What is this charge that the judge thinks I must have a very corrupt heart to make? It was a purpose on the part of certain high functionaries to make it impossible for the people of one state to prohibit the people of any other state from entering it with their property, so-called, and making it a slave state. In other words, it was a charge implying a design to make the institution of slavery national. And now I ask your attention to what Judge Douglas has himself done here. I know he made that part of the speech as a reason why he had refused to vote for a certain man for public printer. But when we get at it, the charge itself is the very one I made against him that he thinks I am so corrupt for uttering. Now, whom does he make that charge against? Does he make it against that newspaper editor merely? No. He says it is identical in spirit with the Lecompton Constitution, and so the framers of that Constitution are brought in with the editor of the newspaper in that fatal blow being struck. He did not call it a conspiracy. In his language, it is a fatal blow being struck. And if the words carry the meaning better when changed from a conspiracy into a fatal blow being struck, I will change my expression and call it fatal blow being struck. We see the charge made not merely against the editor of the Union, but all the framers of the Lecompton Constitution. And not only so, but the article was an authoritative article. By whose authority? Is there any question but he means it was by the authority of the President and his cabinet, the administration? Is there any sort of question but he means to make that charge? Then there are the editors of the Union, the framers of the Lecompton Constitution, the President of the United States and his cabinet, and all the supporters of the Lecompton Constitution in Congress and out of Congress, who are all involved in this fatal blow being struck. I commend to Judge Douglas's consideration the question of how corrupt a man's heart must be to make such a charge.
There was vociferous cheering from the crowd.
Now, my friends, I have but one branch of the subject in the little time I have left to which to call your attention. And as I shall come to a close at the end of that branch, it is probable that I shall not occupy quite all the time allotted to me. Although on these questions I would like to talk twice as long as I have, I could not enter upon another head and discuss it properly without running over my time. I ask the attention of the people here assembled and elsewhere to the course that Judge Douglas is pursuing every day as bearing upon this question of making slavery national. Not going back to the records, but taking the speeches he makes, the speeches he made yesterday and the day before, and makes constantly all over the country. I ask your attention to them. In the first place, what is necessary to make the institution national? Not war. There is no danger that the people of Kentucky will shoulder their muskets and with a young nigger stuck on every bayonet, march into Illinois and force them upon us. There is no danger of our going over there and making war upon them. Then what is necessary for the nationalization of slavery? It is simply the next Dred Scott decision. It is merely for the Supreme Court to decide that no state under the Constitution can exclude it, just as they have already decided that under the Constitution neither Congress nor the territorial legislature can do it. When that is decided and acquiesced in, the whole thing is done. This being true, and this being the way, as I think, that slavery is to be made national, let us consider what Judge Douglas is doing every day to that end. In the first place, let us see what influence he is exerting on public sentiment. In this and like communities, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Consequently, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions. He makes statutes and decisions possible or impossible to be executed. This must be borne in mind, as also the additional fact that Judge Douglas is a man of vast influence, so great that it is enough for many men to profess to believe anything, when they once find out that Judge Douglas professes to believe it. Consider also the attitude he occupies at the head of a large party, a party which he claims has a majority of all the voters in the country. This man sticks to a decision which forbids the people of a territory from excluding slavery, and he does so not because he says it is right in itself. He does not give any opinion on that, but because it has been decided by the court. And being decided by the court, he is, and you are, bound to take it in your political action as law. Not that he judges at all of its merits, but because a decision of the court is to him a "Thus saith the Lord." He places it on that ground alone, and you will bear in mind that thus committing himself unreservedly to this decision commits him to the next one, just as firmly as to this. He did not commit himself on account of the merit or demerit of the decision, but it is a "Thus saith the Lord." The next decision, as much as this, will be a "Thus saith the Lord." There is nothing that can divert or turn him away from this decision. It is nothing that I point out to him that his great prototype, General Jackson, did not believe in the binding force of decisions. It is nothing to him that Jefferson did not so believe. I have said that I have often heard him approve of Jackson's course in disregarding the decision of the Supreme Court pronouncing a national bank constitutional. He says I did not hear him say so. He denies the accuracy of my recollection. I say he ought to know better than I, but I will make no question about this thing, though it still seems to me that I heard him say it 20 times. I will tell him, though, that he now claims to stand on the Cincinnati platform, which affirms that Congress cannot charter a national bank, in the teeth of that old standing decision that Congress can charter a bank. And I remind him of another piece of history on the question of respect for judicial decisions. And it is a piece of Illinois history, belonging to a time when the large party to which Judge Douglas belonged were displeased with a decision of the Supreme Court of Illinois because they had decided that a governor could not remove a Secretary of State. You will find the whole story in Ford's History of Illinois, and I know that Judge Douglas will not deny that he was then in favor of oversloughing that decision by the mode of adding 5 new judges, so as to vote down the 4 old ones. Not only so, but it ended in the judges sitting down on that very bench as one of the 5 new judges to break down the 4 old ones. It was in this way precisely that he got his title of judge. Now, when the judge tells me that men appointed conditionally to sit as members of a court will have to be catechized beforehand upon some subject, I say, "You know, Judge, you have tried it." When he says a court of this kind will lose the confidence of all men, will be prostituted and disgraced by such a proceeding, I say, "You know best, Judge. You have been through the mill." But I cannot shake Judge Douglas's teeth loose from the Dred Scott decision. Like some obstinate animal, I mean no disrespect, that will hang on when he has once got his teeth fixed. You may cut off a leg, or you may tear away an arm, still he will not relax his hold. And so I may point out to the judge and say that he is bespattered all over from the beginning of his political life to the present time with attacks upon judicial decisions. I may cut off limb after limb of his public record and strive to wrench him from a single dictum of the court, yet I cannot divert him from it. He hangs to the last to the Dred Scott decision. These things show there is a purpose strong as death and eternity for which he adheres to this decision and for which he will adhere to all other decisions of the same court.
There was vociferous applause from the crowd. A Hibernian voice said, "Give us something besides Dred Scott."
Yes, no doubt you want to hear something that don't hurt.
There was laughter and applause.
Now, having spoken of the Dred Scott decision, one more word and I am done. Henry Clay, my beau ideal of a statesman, the man for whom I fought all my humble life, Henry Clay once said of a class of men who would repress all tendencies to liberty and ultimate emancipation, that they must, if they would do this, go back to the era of our independence and muzzle the cannon which thunders its annual joyous return. They must blow out the moral lights around us. They must penetrate the human soul and eradicate there the love of liberty. And then, and not till then, could they perpetuate slavery in this country. To my thinking, Judge Douglas is, by his example and vast influence, doing that very thing in this community when he says that the Negro has nothing in the Declaration of Independence. Henry Clay plainly understood the contrary. Judge Douglas is going back to the era of our Revolution and, to the extent of his ability, muzzling the cannon which thunders its annual joyous return. When he invites any people willing to have slavery to establish it, he is blowing out the moral lights around us. When he says, he cares not whether slavery is voted down or voted up, that it is a sacred right of self-government, he is, in my judgment, penetrating the human soul and eradicating the light of reason and the love of liberty in this American people. And now I will only say that when, by all these means and appliances, Judge Douglas shall succeed in bringing public sentiment to an exact accordance with his own views, when these vast assemblages shall echo back all these sentiments, when they shall come to repeat his views and to avow his principles and to say all that he says on these mighty questions, then it needs only the formality of the second Dred Scott decision, which he endorses in advance, to make slavery alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, North as well as South. My friends, that ends the chapter. The judge can take his half hour.
Mr. Douglas's reply.
Fellow citizens, I will now occupy the half hour allotted to me in replying to Mr. Lincoln. The first point to which I will call your attention is as to what I said about the organization of the Republican Party in 1854 and the platform that was formed on the 5th of October of that year. And I will then put the question to Mr. Lincoln whether or not he approves of each article in that platform and ask for a specific answer. I did not charge him with being a member of the committee which reported that platform. I charged that that platform was the platform of the Republican Party adopted by them. The fact that it was the platform of the Republican Party is not denied. But Mr. Lincoln now says that although his name was on the committee which reported it, that he does not think that he was there, but thinks he was in Tazewell, holding court.
Someone from the crowd said, "He said he was there."
Gentlemen, I ask your silence and no interruption. Now, I want to remind Mr. Lincoln that he was at Springfield when that convention was held and those resolutions adopted.
Other voices said, "You can't do it. He wasn't there," and so forth. Mr. Glover, chairman of the Republican committee, said, "I hope no Republican will interrupt Mr. Douglas. The masses listen to Mr. Lincoln attentively, and as respectable men we ought now to hear Mr. Douglas and without interruption."
The point that I am going to remind Mr. Lincoln of is this, that after I had made my speech in 1854, during the fair, he gave me notice that he was going to reply to me the next day. I was sick at that time, but I stayed over in Springfield to hear his reply and to reply to him. On that day, this very convention, the resolutions adopted by which I have read was to meet in the Senate chamber. He spoke in the hall of the House, and when he got through his speech, my recollection is distinct, and I shall never forget it. Mr. Cotting walked in as I took the stand to reply and gave notice that the Republican State Convention would meet instantly in the Senate chamber and called upon the Republicans to retire there and go into this very convention instead of remaining and listening to me.
From the crowd came, "3 cheers for Douglas." Mr. Lincoln interrupted excitedly and angrily.
Judge, add that I went along with them.
This interruption was made in a pitiful, mean, sneaking way as Lincoln floundered around the stand.
Gentlemen, Mr. Lincoln tells me to add that he went along with them to the Senate chamber. I will not add that because I do not know whether he did or not.
Mr. Lincoln interrupted.
I know he did not.
2 of the Republican committee here seized Mr. Lincoln, and by a sudden jerk caused him to disappear from the front of the stand, one of them saying quite audibly, "What are you making such a fuss for? Douglas didn't interrupt you, and can't you see that the people don't like it?"
I do not know whether he knows it or not. That's not the point, and I will yet bring him onto the question. In the first place, Mr. Lincoln was selected by the very men who made the Republican organization on that day to reply to me. He spoke for them and for that party, and he was the leader of that party. And on the very day he made his speech in reply to me, preaching up this same doctrine of Negro equality under the Declaration of Independence, this Republican Party met in convention. Another evidence that he was acting in concert with them is to be found in the fact that convention waited an hour after its time of meeting to hear Lincoln's speech, and Cotting, one of their leading men, marched in the moment Lincoln got through and gave notice that they did not want to hear me and would proceed with the business of the convention. Still another fact. I have here a newspaper printed at Springfield, Mr. Lincoln's own town, in October 1854, a few days afterwards, publishing these resolutions, charging Mr. Lincoln with entertaining these sentiments and trying to prove that they were also the sentiments of Mr. Yates, then candidate for Congress. This has been published on Mr. Lincoln over and over again, and never before has he denied it. But my friends, this denial of his that he did not act on the committee is a miserable quibble to avoid the main issue, which is that this Republican platform declares in favor of the unconditional repeal of the fugitive slave law. Has Lincoln answered whether he endorsed that or not? I called his attention to it when I first addressed you and asked him for an answer, and I then predicted that he would not answer. How does he answer? Why, that he was not on the committee that wrote the resolutions. I then repeated the next proposition contained in the resolutions, which was to restrict slavery in those states in which it exists, and asked him whether he endorsed it. Does he answer yes or no? He says in reply, I was not on the committee at that time. I was in Tazewell. The next question I put to him was whether he was in favor of prohibiting the admission of any more slave states into the Union. I put the question to him distinctly whether, if people of the territory, when they had sufficient population to make a state, should form their constitution recognizing slavery, he would vote for or against its admission. He is a candidate for the United States Senate, and it is possible, if he should be elected, that he would have to vote directly on that question. I asked him to answer me and you whether he would vote to admit a state into the Union with slavery or without it, as its own people might choose. He did not answer that question. He dodges that question also, under the cover that he was not on the committee at that time, that he was not present when the platform was made. I want to know if he should happen to be in the Senate when a state applied for admission with a constitution acceptable to her own people, he would vote to admit that state if slavery was one of its institutions. He avoids the answer.
Mr. Lincoln interrupted a third time excitedly.
No, Judge!
Mr. Lincoln again disappeared suddenly, aided by a pull from behind.
It is true he gives the abolitionist to understand by a hint that he would not vote to admit such a state. And why? He goes on to say that the man who would talk about giving each state the right to have slavery or not as it pleased was akin to the man who would muzzle the guns which thundered forth the annual joyous return of the day of our independence. He says that kind of talk is casting a blight on the glory of this country. What is the meaning of that? That he is not in favor of each state having the right to do as it pleases on the slavery question? I will put the question to him again and again, and I intend to force it out of him.
There was immense applause.
Then again, this platform, which was made at Springfield by his own party when he was its acknowledged head, provides that Republicans will insist on the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. And I asked Lincoln specifically whether he agreed with them in that. Did you get an answer? He is afraid to answer it. He knows I will trot him down to Egypt. I intend to make him answer there, or I will show the people of Illinois that he does not intend to answer these questions. The convention to which I have been alluding goes a little further and pledges itself to exclude slavery from all the territories over which the general government has exclusive jurisdiction north of 36 degrees 30 minutes, as well as south. Now I want to know whether he approves that provision. I want him to answer, and when he does, I want to know his opinion on another point, which is whether he will redeem the pledge of this platform and resist the acquirement of any more territory unless slavery therein shall be forever prohibited. I want him to answer this last question. Each of the questions I have put to him are practical questions, questions based upon the fundamental principles of the Black Republican Party. And I want to know whether he is the first, last, and only choice of a party with whom he does not agree in principle. He does not deny but that principle was unanimously adopted by the Republican Party. He does not deny that the whole Republican Party is pledged to it. He does not deny that a man who is not faithful to it is faithless to the Republican Party. And now I want to know whether that party is unanimously in favor of a man who does not adopt that creed and agree with them in their principles. I want to know whether the man who does not agree with them and who is afraid to avow his differences and who dodges the issue is the first, last, and only choice of the Republican Party.
There were cheers, and a voice said, "How about the conspiracy?"
Never mind, I will come to that soon enough. But the platform which I have read to you not only lays down these principles, but it adds, resolved, that in furtherance of these principles, we will use such constitutional and lawful means as shall seem best adapted to their accomplishment, and that we will support no man for office under the general or state government who is not positively and fully committed to the support of these principles, and whose personal character and conduct is not a guarantee that he is reliable, and who shall not have abjured old party allegiance and ties. The Black Republican Party stands pledged that they will never support Lincoln until he has pledged himself to that platform. But he cannot devise his answer. He has not made up his mind whether he will or not. He talked about everything else he could think of to occupy his hour and a half, and when he could not think of anything more to say, without an excuse for refusing to answer these questions, he sat down long before his time was out. In relation to Mr. Lincoln's charge of conspiracy against me, I have a word to say. In his speech today, he quotes a playful part of his speech at Springfield about Stephen and James and Franklin and Roger, and says that I did not take exception to it. I did not answer it, and he repeats it again. I did not take exception to this figure of his. He has a right to be as playful as he pleases in throwing his arguments together, and I will not object. But I did take objection to his second Springfield speech, in which he stated that he intended his first speech as a charge of corruption or conspiracy against the Supreme Court of the United States, President Pierce, President Buchanan, and myself. That gave the offensive character to the charge. He then said that when he made it, he did not know whether it was true or not. But inasmuch as Judge Douglas had not denied it, although he had replied to other parts of his speech 3 times, he repeated it as a charge of conspiracy against me, thus charging me with moral turpitude. When he put it in that form, I did say that inasmuch as he repeated the charge simply because I had not denied it, I would deprive him of the opportunity of ever repeating it again by declaring that it was in all its bearings an infamous lie.
From the crowd came 3 cheers for Douglas.
He says he will repeat it until I answer his folly and nonsense about Stephen and Franklin and Roger and Bob and James. He studied that out, prepared that one sentence with the greatest care, committed it to memory, and put it in his first Springfield speech. And now he carries that speech around and reads that sentence to show how pretty it is. His vanity is wounded because I will not go into that beautiful figure of his about the building of a house. All I have to say is that I am not green enough to let him make a charge which he acknowledges he does not know to be true, and then take up my time in answering it when I know it to be false and nobody else knows it to be true. I have not brought a charge of moral turpitude against him. When he or any other man brings one against me, instead of disproving it, I will say that it is a lie, and let him prove it if he can.
There was enthusiastic applause.
I have lived 25 years in Illinois. I have served you with all the fidelity and ability which I possess. And Mr. Lincoln is at liberty to attack my public action, my votes, and my conduct. But when he dares to attack my moral integrity by a charge of conspiracy between myself, Chief Justice Taney, and the Supreme Court, and 2 presidents of the United States, I will repel it. Mr. Lincoln has not character enough for integrity and truth merely on his own ipse dixit to arraign President Buchanan, President Pierce, and 9 judges of the Supreme Court, not one of whom would be complimented by being put on an equality with him. There is an unpardonable presumption in a man putting himself up before thousands of people and pretending that his ipse dixit, without proof, without fact, and without truth, is enough to bring down and destroy the purest and best of living men. Fellow citizens, my time is fast expiring. I must pass on. Mr. Lincoln wants to know why I voted against Mr. Chase's amendment to the Nebraska bill. I will tell him. In the first place, the bill already conferred all the power which Congress had, by giving the people the whole power over the subject. Chase offered a proviso that they might abolish slavery, which by implication would convey the idea that they could prohibit it by not introducing that institution. General Cass asked him to modify his amendment so as to provide that the people might either prohibit or introduce slavery and thus make it fair and equal. Chase refused to so modify his proviso, and then General Cass and all the rest of us voted it down. These facts appear on the journals and debates of Congress, where Mr. Lincoln found the charge, and if he had told the whole truth, there would have been no necessity for me to occupy your time in explaining the matter. Mr. Lincoln wants to know why the word state as well as territory was put into the Nebraska bill. I will tell him. It was put there to meet just such false arguments as he has been adducing. That first, not only the people of the territory should do as they pleased, but when they come to be admitted as states, they should come into the Union with or without slavery as the people determined. I meant to knock in the head this abolition doctrine of Mr. Lincoln's, that there shall be no more slave states even if the people want them. And it does not do for him to say, or for any black Republican to say, that there is nobody in favor of the doctrine of no more slave states, and that nobody wants to interfere with the right of the people to do as they please. What was the origin of the Missouri difficulty and the Missouri Compromise? The people of Missouri formed a constitution as a slave state and asked admission into the Union, but the Free Soil Party of the North, being in a majority, refused to admit her because she had slavery as one of her institutions. Hence, this first slavery agitation arose upon a state and not upon a territory, and yet Mr. Lincoln does not know why the word state was placed in the Kansas-Nebraska bill. The whole abolition agitation arose on that doctrine of prohibiting a state from coming in with slavery or not, as it pleased. And that same doctrine is here in this Republican platform of 1854. It has never been repealed, and every black Republican stands pledged by that platform never to vote for any man who is not in favor of it. Yet Mr. Lincoln does not know that there is a man in the world who is in favor of preventing a state from coming in as it pleases notwithstanding. The Springfield platform says that they, the Republican Party, will not allow a state to come in under such circumstances. He is an ignorant man. Now you see that upon these very points, I am as far from bringing Mr. Lincoln up to the line as I ever was before. He does not want to avow his principles. I do want to avow mine, as clear as sunlight in midday. Democracy is founded upon the eternal principle of right. The plainer these principles are avowed before the people, the stronger will be the support which they will receive. I only wish I had the power to make them so clear they would shine in the heavens for every man, woman, and child to read. The first of those principles that I would proclaim would be in opposition to Mr. Lincoln's doctrine of uniformity between the different states, and I would declare instead the sovereign right of each state to decide the slavery question as well as all other domestic questions for themselves, without interference from any other state or power whatsoever. When that principle is recognized, you will have peace and harmony and fraternal feeling between all the states of this Union. Until you do recognize that doctrine, there will be sectional warfare agitating and distracting the country. What does Mr. Lincoln propose? He says that the Union cannot exist divided into free and slave states. If it cannot endure thus divided, then he must strive to make them all free or all slave, which will inevitably bring about a dissolution of the Union. Gentlemen, I am told that my time is out, and I am obliged to stop.
3 times 3 cheers were here given for Senator Douglas. Second debate with Stephen A. Douglas at Freeport, Illinois, August 27, 1858. Mr. Lincoln's speech. Mr. Lincoln was introduced by the Honorable Thomas J. Turner and was greeted with loud cheers. When the applause had subsided, he said,
Ladies and gentlemen, on Saturday last, Judge Douglas and myself first met in public discussion. He spoke 1 hour, I an hour and a half, and he replied for half an hour. The order is now reversed. I am to speak an hour, he an hour and a half, and then I am to reply for half an hour. I propose to devote myself during the first hour to the scope of what was brought within the range of his half-hour speech at Ottawa. Of course, there was brought within the scope, in that half-hour's speech, something of his own opening speech. In the course of that opening argument, Judge Douglas proposed to me 7 distinct interrogatories. In my speech of an hour and a half, I attended to some other parts of his speech, and incidentally, as I thought, answered one of the interrogatories then. I then distinctly intimated to him that I would answer the rest of his interrogatories on condition only that he should agree to answer as many for me. He made no intimation at the time of the proposition, nor did he, in his reply, allude at all to that suggestion of mine. I do him no injustice in saying that he occupied at least half of his reply in dealing with me as though I had refused to answer his interrogatories. I now propose that I will answer any of the interrogatories upon condition that he will answer questions from me not exceeding the same number. I give him an opportunity to respond. The judge remains silent. I now say to you that I will answer his interrogatories whether he answers mine or not, and that after I have done so, I shall propound mine to him. I have supposed myself, since the organization of the Republican Party at Bloomington in May 1856, bound as a party man by the platforms of the party, then and since. If, in any interrogatories which I shall answer, I go beyond the scope of what is within these platforms, it will be perceived that no one is responsible but myself. Having said thus much, I will take up the judge's interrogatories as I find them printed in the Chicago Times and answer them seriatim. In order that there may be no mistake about it, I have copied the interrogatories in writing and also my answers to them. The first one of these interrogatories is in these words. Question 1. I desire to know whether Lincoln today stands, as he did in 1854, in favor of the unconditional repeal of the Fugitive Slave Law. Answer. I do not now, nor ever did, stand in favor of the unconditional repeal of the Fugitive Slave Law. Question 2. I desire him to answer whether he stands pledged today, as he did in 1854, against the admission of any more slave states into the Union, even if the people want them. Answer. I do not now, nor ever did, stand pledged against the admission of any more slave states into the Union. Question 3. I want to know whether he stands pledged against the admission of a new state into the Union, with such a constitution as the people of that state may see fit to make. Answer. I do not stand pledged against the admission of a new state into the Union with such a constitution as the people of that state may see fit to make. Question 4. I want to know whether he stands today pledged to the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. Answer. I do not stand today pledged to the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. Question 5. I desire him to answer whether he stands pledged to the prohibition of the slave trade between the different states. Answer. I do not stand pledged to the prohibition of the slave trade between the different states. Question 6. I desire to know whether he stands pledged to prohibit slavery in all the territories of the United States, north as well as south of the Missouri Compromise line. Answer. I am impliedly, if not expressly, pledged to a belief in the right and duty of Congress to prohibit slavery in all the United States territories. Question 7. I desire him to answer whether he is opposed to the acquisition of any new territory unless slavery is first prohibited therein. Answer: I am not generally opposed to honest acquisition of territory, and in any given case, I would or would not oppose such acquisition accordingly as I might think such acquisition would or would not aggravate the slavery question among ourselves. Now, my friends, it will be perceived upon an examination of these questions and answers that so far I have only answered that I was not pledged to this, that, or the other. The judge has not framed his interrogatories to ask me anything more than this, and I have answered in strict accordance with the interrogatories, and have answered truly that I am not pledged at all upon any of the points to which I have answered. But I am not disposed to hang upon the exact form of his interrogatory. I am rather disposed to take up at least some of these questions and state what I really think upon them. As to the first one, in regard to the fugitive slave law, I have never hesitated to say, and I do not now hesitate to say, that I think, under the Constitution of the United States, the people of the Southern states are entitled to a congressional fugitive slave law. Having said that, I have had nothing to say in regard to the existing fugitive slave law, further than that I think it should have been framed so as to be free from some of the objections that pertain to it, without lessening its efficiency. And inasmuch as we are not now in an agitation in regard to an alteration or modification of that law, I would not be the man to introduce it as a new subject of agitation upon the general question of slavery. In regard to the other question of whether I am pledged to the admission of any more slave states into the Union, I state to you very frankly that I would be exceedingly sorry ever to be put in a position of having to pass upon that question. I should be exceedingly glad to know that there would never be another slave state admitted into the Union. But I must add that if slavery shall be kept out of the territories during the territorial existence of any one given territory, and then the people shall, having a fair chance and a clear field, when they come to adopt the Constitution, do such an extraordinary thing as to adopt a slave constitution, uninfluenced by the actual presence of the institution among them, I see no alternative, if we own the country, but to admit them into the Union. The third interrogatory is answered by the answer to the second, it being, as I conceive, the same as the second. The fourth one is in regard to the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. In relation to that, I have my mind very distinctly made up. I should be exceedingly glad to see slavery abolished in the District of Columbia. I believe that Congress possesses the constitutional power to abolish it. Yet, as a member of Congress, I should not, with my present views, be in favor of endeavoring to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia unless it would be upon these conditions. First, that the abolition should be gradual. Second, that it should be on a vote of the majority of qualified voters in the district. And third, that compensation should be made to unwilling owners. With these three conditions, I confess I would be exceedingly glad to see Congress abolish slavery in the District of Columbia and, in the language of Henry Clay, sweep from our capital that foul blot upon our nation. In regard to the fifth interrogatory, I must say here that as to the question of the abolition of the slave trade between the different states, I can truly answer, as I have, that I am pledged to nothing about it. It is a subject to which I have not given that mature consideration that would make me feel authorized to state a position so as to hold myself entirely bound by it. In other words, that question has never been prominently enough before me to induce me to investigate, whether we really have the constitutional power to do it. I could investigate it if I had sufficient time to bring myself to a conclusion upon that subject, but I have not done so, and I say so frankly to you here and to Judge Douglas. I must say, however, that if I should be of opinion that Congress does possess the constitutional power to abolish the slave trade among the different states, I should still not be in favor of the exercise of that power, unless upon some conservative principle, as I conceive it, akin to what I have said in relation to the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. My answer as to whether I desire that slavery should be prohibited in all the territories of the United States is full and explicit within itself, and cannot be made clearer by any comments of mine. So, I suppose, in regard to the question whether I am opposed to the acquisition of any more territory unless slavery is first prohibited therein, my answer is such that I could add nothing by way of illustration, or making myself better understood than the answer which I have placed in writing. Now, in all this, the judge has me, and he has me on the record. I suppose he had flattered himself that I was really entertaining one set of opinions for one place and another set for another place, that I was afraid to say at one place what I uttered at another. What I am saying here, I suppose I say to a vast audience as strongly tending to abolitionism as any audience in the state of Illinois, and I believe I am saying that which, if it would be offensive to any persons, and render them enemies to myself, would be offensive to persons in this audience. I now proceed to propound to the judge the interrogatories so far as I have framed them. I will bring forward a new installment when I get them ready. I will bring them forward now, only reaching to number 4. The first one is, Question 1. If the people of Kansas shall, by means entirely unobjectionable in all other respects, adopt a state constitution, and ask admission into the Union under it, before they have the requisite number of inhabitants, according to the English bill, some 93,000, will you vote to admit them? Question 2. Can the people of a United States territory, in any lawful way, against the wish of any citizen of the United States, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution? Question 3. If the Supreme Court of the United States shall decide that states cannot exclude slavery from their limits, are you in favor of acquiescing in, adopting, and following such decision as a rule of political action? Question 4. Are you in favor of acquiring additional territory in disregard of how such acquisition may affect the nation on the slavery question? As introductory to these interrogatories, which Judge Douglas propounded to me at Ottawa, he read a set of resolutions which he said Judge Trumbull and myself had participated in adopting in the first Republican State Convention held at Springfield in October 1854. He insisted that I and Judge Trumbull, and perhaps the entire Republican Party, were responsible for the doctrines contained in the set of resolutions which he read, and I understand that it was from that set of resolutions that he deduced the interrogatories which he propounded to me, using these resolutions as a sort of authority for propounding those questions to me. Now I say here today that I do not answer his interrogatories because of their springing at all from that set of resolutions which he read. I answered them because Judge Douglas thought fit to ask them. I do not now, nor never did recognize any responsibility upon myself in that set of resolutions. When I replied to him on that occasion, I assured him that I never had anything to do with them. I repeat here today that I never, in any possible form, had anything to do with that set of resolutions. It turns out, I believe, that those resolutions were never passed in any convention held in Springfield. It turns out that they were never passed at any convention or any public meeting that I had any part in. I believe it turns out, in addition to all this, that there was not, in the fall of 1854, any convention holding a session in Springfield, calling itself a Republican State Convention. Yet it is true that there was a convention, or assemblage of men calling themselves a convention, at Springfield that did pass some resolutions. But so little did I really know of the proceedings of that convention, or what set of resolutions they had passed, though having a general knowledge that there had been such an assemblage of men there, that when Judge Douglas read the resolutions, I really did not know but they had been the resolutions passed then and there. I did not question that they were the resolutions adopted, for I could not bring myself to suppose that Judge Douglas could say what he did upon this subject without knowing that it was true. I contented myself on that occasion with denying, as I truly could, all connection with them, not denying or affirming whether they were passed at Springfield. Now it turns out that he had got hold of some resolutions passed at some convention or public meeting in Kane County. I wish to say here that I don't conceive that, in any fair and just mind, this discovery relieves me at all. I had just as much to do with the convention in Kane County as that in Springfield. I am just as much responsible for the resolutions at Kane County as those at Springfield, the amount of the responsibility being exactly nothing in either case, no more than there would be in regard to a set of resolutions passed in the moon. I allude to this extraordinary matter in this canvass for some further purpose than anything yet advanced. Judge Douglas did not make his statement upon that occasion as matters that he believed to be true, but he stated them roundly as being true, in such form as to pledge his veracity for their truth. When the whole matter turns out as it does, and when we consider who Judge Douglas is, that he is a distinguished senator of the United States, that he has served nearly 12 years as such, that his character is not at all limited as an ordinary senator of the United States, but that his name has become of worldwide renown, it is most extraordinary that he should so far forget all the suggestions of justice to an adversary, or of prudence to himself, as to venture upon the assertion of that which the slightest investigation would have shown him to be wholly false. I can only account for his having done so upon the supposition that that evil genius which has attended him through his life, giving to him an apparent astonishing prosperity, such as to lead very many good men to doubt there being any advantage in virtue over vice, I say I can only account for it on the supposition that that evil genius has at last made up its mind to forsake him. And I may add that another extraordinary feature of the judge's conduct in this canvass, made more extraordinary by this incident, is that he is in the habit, in almost all the speeches he makes, of charging falsehood upon his adversaries, myself and others. I now ask whether he is able to find, in anything that Judge Trumbull, for instance, has said, or in anything that I have said, a justification at all compared with what we have in this instance for that sort of vulgarity. I have been in the habit of charging, as a matter of belief on my part, that in the introduction of the Nebraska bill into Congress, there was a conspiracy to make slavery perpetual and national. I have arranged from time to time the evidence which establishes and proves the truth of this charge. I recurred to this charge at Ottawa. I shall not now have time to dwell upon it at very great length, but inasmuch as Judge Douglas, in his reply of half an hour, made some points upon me in relation to it, I propose noticing a few of them. The judge insists that in the first speech I made, in which I very distinctly made that charge, he thought for a good while I was in fun, that I was playful, that I was not sincere about it, and that he only grew angry and somewhat excited when he found that I insisted upon it as a matter of earnestness. He says he characterized it as a falsehood as far as I implicated his moral character in that transaction. Well, I did not know, till he presented that view, that I had implicated his moral character. He is very much in the habit, when he argues me up into a position I never thought of occupying, of very cozily saying he has no doubt Lincoln is conscientious in saying so. He should remember that I did not know but what he was altogether conscientious in that matter. I can conceive it possible for men to conspire to do a good thing, and I really find nothing in Judge Douglas's course or arguments that is contrary to or inconsistent with his belief of a conspiracy to nationalize and spread slavery as being a good and blessed thing. And so I hope he will understand that I do not at all question, but that, in all this matter, he is entirely conscientious. But to draw your attention to one of the points I made in this case, beginning at the beginning. When the Nebraska bill was introduced, or a short time afterwards, by an amendment, I believe, it was provided that it must be considered the true intent and meaning of this act not to legislate slavery into any state or territory, or to exclude it therefrom, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their own domestic institutions in their own way, subject only to the Constitution of the United States. I have called his attention to the fact that when he and some others began arguing that they were giving an increased degree of liberty to the people in the territories over and above what they formerly had on the question of slavery, a question was raised whether the law was enacted to give such unconditional liberty to the people. And to test the sincerity of this mode of argument, Mr. Chase of Ohio introduced an amendment in which he made the law, if the amendment were adopted, expressly declare that the people of the territory should have the power to exclude slavery if they saw fit. I have asked attention also to the fact that Judge Douglas and those who acted with him voted that amendment down, notwithstanding it expressed exactly the thing they said was the true intent and meaning of the law. I have called attention to the fact that in subsequent times a decision of the Supreme Court has been made in which it has been declared that a territorial legislature has no constitutional right to exclude slavery. And I have argued and said that for men who did intend that the people of the territory should have the right to exclude slavery absolutely and unconditionally, the voting down of Chase's amendment is wholly inexplicable. It is a puzzle, a riddle. But I have said that with men who did look forward to such a decision, or who had it in contemplation that such a decision of the Supreme Court would or might be made, the voting down of that amendment would be perfectly rational and intelligible. It would keep Congress from coming in collision with the decision when it was made. Anybody can conceive that if there was an intention or expectation that such a decision was to follow, it would not be a very desirable party attitude to get into for the Supreme Court, all or nearly all its members belonging to the same party, to decide one way when the party in Congress had decided the other way. Hence, it would be very rational for men expecting such a decision to keep the niche in that law clear for it. After pointing this out, I tell Judge Douglas that it looks to me as though here was the reason why Chase's amendment was voted down. I tell him that as he did it, and knows why he did it, if it was done for a reason different from this, he knows what that reason was, and can tell us what it was. I tell him also, it will be vastly more satisfactory to the country for him to give some other plausible, intelligible reason why it was voted down than to stand upon his dignity and call people liars. Well, on Saturday he did make his answer, and what do you think it was? He says, if I had only taken upon myself to tell the whole truth about that amendment of Chase's, no explanation would have been necessary on his part, or words to that effect. Now, I say here that I am quite unconscious of having suppressed anything material to the case, and I am very frank to admit, if there is any sound reason other than that which appeared to me material, it is quite fair for him to present it. What reason does he propose? That when Chase came forward with his amendment expressly authorizing the people to exclude slavery from the limits of every territory, General Cass proposed to Chase, if he, Chase, would add to his amendment that the people should have the power to introduce or exclude, they would let it go. This is substantially all of his reply. And because Chase would not do that, they voted his amendment down. Well, it turns out, I believe, upon examination, that General Cass took some part in the little running debate upon that amendment, and then ran away, and did not vote on it at all. Is not that the fact? So confident as I think was General Cass that there was a snake somewhere about, he chose to run away from the whole thing. This is an inference I draw from the fact that though he took part in the debate, his name does not appear in the ayes and noes. But does Judge Douglas's reply amount to a satisfactory answer? There is some little difference of opinion here. But I ask attention to a few more views, bearing on the question of whether it amounts to a satisfactory answer. The men who were determined that that amendment should not get into the bill and spoil the place where the Dred Scott decision was to come in, sought an excuse to get rid of it somewhere. One of these ways, one of these excuses, was to ask Chase to add to his proposed amendment a provision that the people might introduce slavery if they wanted to. They very well knew Chase would do no such thing, that Mr. Chase was one of the men differing from them on the broad principle of his insisting that freedom was better than slavery, a man who would not consent to enact a law penned with his own hand by which he was made to recognize slavery on the one hand and liberty on the other as precisely equal. And when they insisted on his doing this, they very well knew they insisted on that which he would not for a moment think of doing, and that they were only bluffing him. I believe I have not, since he made his answer, had a chance to examine the journals or Congressional Globe and therefore speak from memory. I believe the state of the bill at that time, according to parliamentary rules, was such that no member could propose an additional amendment to Chase's amendment. I rather think this is the truth. Well, the judge shakes his head. Very well. I would like to know, then, if they wanted Chase's amendment fixed over, why somebody else could not have offered to do it. If they wanted it amended, why did they not offer the amendment? Why did they stand there taunting and quibbling at Chase? Why did they not put it in themselves? But to put it on the other ground, suppose that there was such an amendment offered, and Chase's was an amendment to an amendment. Until one is disposed of by parliamentary law, you cannot pile another on. Then all these gentlemen had to do was to vote Chase's on, and then in the amended form in which the whole stood, add their own amendment to it if they wanted it put in that shape. This was all they were obliged to do, and the ayes and noes show that there were 36 who voted it down against 10 who voted in favor of it. The 36 held entire sway and control. They could, in some form or other, have put that bill in the exact shape they wanted. If there was a rule preventing their amending it at the time, they could pass that, and then Chase's amendment, being merged, put it in the shape they wanted. They did not choose to do so, but they went into a quibble with Chase to get him to add what they knew he would not add, and because he would not, they stand upon that flimsy pretext for voting down what they argued was the meaning and intent of their own bill. They left room, thereby, for this Dred Scott decision, which goes very far to make slavery national throughout the United States. I pass one or two points I have because my time will very soon expire. But I must be allowed to say that Judge Douglas recurs again, as he did upon one or two other occasions, to the enormity of Lincoln, an insignificant individual like Lincoln, upon his ipse-dixit charging a conspiracy upon a large number of members of Congress, the Supreme Court, and 2 presidents to nationalize slavery. I want to say that in the first place, I have made no charge of this sort upon my ipse-dixit. I have only arrayed the evidence tending to prove it, and presented it to the understanding of others, saying what I think it proves, but giving you the means of judging whether it proves it or not. This is precisely what I have done. I have not placed it upon my ipse-dixit at all. On this occasion, I wish to recall his attention to a piece of evidence which I brought forward at Ottawa on Saturday, showing that he had made substantially the same charge against substantially the same persons, excluding his dear self from the category. I ask him to give some attention to the evidence which I brought forward, that he himself had discovered a fatal blow being struck against the right of the people to exclude slavery from their limits, which fatal blow he assumed as in evidence in an article in the Washington Union, published by authority. I ask, by whose authority? He discovers a similar or identical provision in the Lecompton Constitution. Made by whom? The framers of that Constitution. Advocated by whom? By all the members of the party in the nation who advocated the introduction of Kansas into the Union under the Lecompton Constitution. I have asked his attention to the evidence that he arrayed to prove that such a fatal blow was being struck, and to the facts which he brought forward in support of that charge, being identical with the one which he thinks so villainous in me. He pointed it not at a newspaper editor merely, but at the President and his cabinet, and the members of Congress advocating the Lecompton Constitution and those framing that instrument. I must again be permitted to remind him that although my ipse-dixit may not be as great as his, yet it somewhat reduces the force of his calling my attention to the enormity of my making a like charge against him. Go on, Judge Douglas.
Mr. Douglas's speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, the silence with which you have listened to Mr. Lincoln during his hour is creditable to this vast audience, composed of men of various political parties. Nothing is more honorable to any large mass of people assembled for the purpose of a fair discussion than that kind and respectful attention that is yielded not only to your political friends but to those who are opposed to you in politics. I am glad that at last I have brought Mr. Lincoln to the conclusion that he had better define his position on certain political questions to which I called his attention at Ottawa. He there showed no disposition, no inclination to answer them. I did not present idle questions for him, merely for my gratification. I laid the foundation for those interrogatories by showing that they constituted the platform of the party whose nominee he is for the Senate. I did not presume that I had the right to catechize him as I saw proper, unless I showed that his party, or a majority of it, stood upon the platform and were in favor of the propositions upon which my questions were based. I desired simply to know, inasmuch as he had been nominated as the first, last, and only choice of his party, whether he had concurred in the platform which that party had adopted for its government. In a few moments I will proceed to review the answers which he has given to these interrogatories. But in order to relieve his anxiety, I will first respond to those which he has presented to me. Mark you, he has not presented interrogatories which have ever received the sanction of the party with which I am acting, and hence he has no other foundation for them than his own curiosity. First, he desires to know if the people of Kansas shall form a constitution by means entirely proper and unobjectionable, and ask admission into the Union as a state before they have the requisite population for a member of Congress, whether I will vote for that admission. Well, now, I regret exceedingly that he did not answer that interrogatory himself before he put it to me, in order that we might understand and not be left to infer on which side he is. Mr. Trumbull, during the last session of Congress, voted from the beginning to the end against the admission of Oregon, although a free state, because she had not the requisite population for a member of Congress. Mr. Trumbull would not consent under any circumstances to let a state, free or slave, come into the Union until it had the requisite population. As Mr. Trumbull is in the field fighting for Mr. Lincoln, I would like to have Mr. Lincoln answer his own question and tell me whether he is fighting Trumbull on that issue or not. But I will answer his question. In reference to Kansas, it is my opinion that as she has population enough to constitute a slave state, she has people enough for a free state. I will not make Kansas an exceptional case to the other states of the Union. I hold it to be a sound rule of universal application to require a territory to contain the requisite population for a member of Congress before it is admitted as a state into the Union. I made that proposition in the Senate in 1856, and I renewed it during the last session in a bill providing that no territory of the United States should form a constitution and apply for admission until it had the requisite population. On another occasion, I proposed that neither Kansas or any other territory should be admitted until it had the requisite population. Congress did not adopt any of my propositions containing this general rule, but did make an exception of Kansas. I will not stand by that exception. Either Kansas must come in as a free state with whatever population she may have, or the rule must be applied to all the other territories alike. I therefore answer at once that, it having been decided that Kansas has people enough for a slave state, I hold she has enough for a free state. I hope Mr. Lincoln is satisfied with my answer. And now, I would like to get his answer to his own interrogatory, whether or not he will vote to admit Kansas before she has the requisite population. I want to know whether he will vote to admit Oregon before that territory has the requisite population. Mr. Trumbull will not, and the same reason that commits Mr. Trumbull against the admission of Oregon commits him against Kansas, even if she should apply for admission as a free state. If there is any sincerity, any truth in the argument of Mr. Trumbull in the Senate against the admission of Oregon because she had not 93,420 people, although her population was larger than that of Kansas, he stands pledged against the admission of both Oregon and Kansas until they have 93,420 inhabitants. I would like Mr. Lincoln to answer this question. I would like him to take his own medicine. If he differs with Mr. Trumbull, let him answer his argument against the admission of Oregon, instead of poking questions at me.
From the crowd came calls of, "Right, good, good," laughter, and cheers.
The next question propounded to me by Mr. Lincoln is, can the people of a territory in any lawful way, against the wishes of any citizens of the United States, exclude slavery from their limits prior to the formation of a state constitution? I answer emphatically, as Mr. Lincoln has heard me answer 100 times from every stump in Illinois, that in my opinion, the people of a territory can, by lawful means, exclude slavery from their limits prior to the formation of a state constitution. Mr. Lincoln knew that I had answered that question over and over again. He heard me argue the Nebraska bill on that principle all over the state in 1854, in 1855, and in 1856, and he has no excuse for pretending to be in doubt as to my position on that question. It matters not what way the Supreme Court may hereafter decide as to the abstract question whether slavery may or may not go into a territory under the Constitution. The people have the lawful means to introduce it or exclude it as they please, for the reason that slavery cannot exist a day or an hour anywhere unless it is supported by local police regulations. Those police regulations can only be established by the local legislature, and if the people are opposed to slavery, they will elect representatives to that body who will, by unfriendly legislation, effectually prevent the introduction of it into their midst. If, on the contrary, they are for it, their legislation will favor its extension. Hence, no matter what the decision of the Supreme Court may be on that abstract question, still, the right of the people to make a slave territory or a free territory is perfect and complete under the Nebraska bill. I hope Mr. Lincoln deems my answer satisfactory on that point. In this connection, I will notice the charge which he has introduced in relation to Mr. Chase's amendment. I thought that I had chased that amendment out of Mr. Lincoln's brain at Ottawa, but it seems that it still haunts his imagination, and he is not yet satisfied. I had supposed that he would be ashamed to press that question further. He is a lawyer and has been a member of Congress and has occupied his time and amused you by telling you about parliamentary proceedings. He ought to have known better than to try to palm off his miserable impositions upon this intelligent audience. The Nebraska bill provided that the legislative power and the authority of the said territory should extend to all rightful subjects of legislation consistent with the Organic Act and the Constitution of the United States. It did not make any exception as to slavery, but gave all the power that it was possible for Congress to give without violating the Constitution to the territorial legislature, with no exception or limitation on the subject of slavery at all. The language of that bill, which I have quoted, gave the full power and the full authority over the subject of slavery, affirmatively and negatively, to introduce it or exclude it so far as the Constitution of the United States would permit. What more could Mr. Chase give by his amendment? Nothing. He offered his amendment for the identical purpose for which Mr. Lincoln is using it, to enable demagogues in the country to try and deceive the people. His amendment was to this effect. It provided that the legislature should have the power to exclude slavery, and General Cass suggested, why not give the power to introduce as well as exclude? The answer was, they have the power already in the bill to do both. Chase was afraid his amendment would be adopted if he put the alternative proposition and so make it fair both ways, but he would not yield. He offered it for the purpose of having it rejected. He offered it, as he himself avowed over and over again, simply to make capital out of it for the stump. He expected that it would be capital for small politicians in the country, and that they would make an effort to deceive the people with it. And he was not mistaken, for Lincoln is carrying out that plan admirably. Lincoln knows that the Nebraska bill without Chase's amendment gave all the power which the Constitution would permit. Could Congress confer any more? Could Congress go beyond the Constitution of the country? We gave all a full grant with no exception in regard to slavery one way or the other. We left that question, as we left all others, to be decided by the people for themselves, just as they pleased. I will not occupy my time on this question. I have argued it before all over Illinois. I have argued it in this beautiful city of Freeport. I have argued it in the North, the South, the East, the West, avowing the same sentiments and the same principles. I have not been afraid to avow my sentiments up here for fear I would be trotted down into Egypt.
There were cheers and laughter from the crowd.
The third question which Mr. Lincoln presented is, if the Supreme Court of the United States shall decide that a state of this Union cannot exclude slavery from its own limits, will I submit to it? I am amazed that Lincoln should ask such a question.
A voice from the crowd said, "A schoolboy knows better."
Yes, a schoolboy does know better. Mr. Lincoln's object is to cast an imputation upon the Supreme Court. He knows that there never was but one man in America claiming any degree of intelligence or decency who ever for a moment pretended such a thing. It is true that the Washington Union, in an article published on the 17th of last December, did put forth that doctrine, and I denounced that article on the floor of the Senate in a speech which Mr. Lincoln now pretends was against the President. The Union had claimed that slavery had a right to go into the free states and that any provision in the Constitution or laws of the free states to the contrary were null and void. I denounced it in the Senate, as I said before, and I was the first man who did. Lincoln's friends, Trumbull and Seward and Hale and Wilson and the whole black Republican side of the Senate were silent. They left it to me to denounce it. And what was the reply made to me on that occasion? Mr. Toombs of Georgia got up and undertook to lecture me on the ground that I ought not to have deemed the article worthy of notice and ought not to have replied to it, that there was not one man, woman, or child south of the Potomac in any slave state who did not repudiate any such pretension. Mr. Lincoln knows that reply was made on the spot, and yet now he asks this question. He might as well ask me, suppose Mr. Lincoln should steal a horse, would I sanction it? And it would be as genteel in me to ask him, in the event he stole a horse, what ought to be done with him. He casts an imputation upon the Supreme Court of the United States by supposing that they would violate the Constitution of the United States. I tell him that such a thing is not possible. It would be an act of moral treason that no man on the bench could ever descend to. Mr. Lincoln himself would never, in his partisan feelings, so far forget what was right as to be guilty of such an act. The fourth question of Mr. Lincoln is, are you in favor of acquiring additional territory in disregard as to how such acquisition may affect the Union on the slavery questions? This question is very ingeniously and cunningly put. The Black Republican Creed lays it down expressly that under no circumstances shall we acquire any more territory unless slavery is first prohibited in the country. I ask Mr. Lincoln whether he is in favor of that proposition. Are you opposed to the acquisition of any more territory under any circumstances unless slavery is prohibited in it? That he does not like to answer. When I ask him whether he stands up to that article in the platform of his party, he turns, Yankee fashion, and without answering it, asks me whether I am in favor of acquiring territory without regard as to how it may affect the Union on the slavery question. I answer that, whenever it becomes necessary, in our growth and progress to acquire more territory, that I am in favor of it, without reference to the question of slavery, and when we have acquired it, I will leave the people free to do as they please, either to make it slave or free territory as they prefer. It is idle to tell me, or you, that we have territory enough. Our fathers supposed that we had enough when our territory extended to the Mississippi River. But a few years' growth and expansion satisfied them that we needed more, and the Louisiana Territory, from the west branch of the Mississippi to the British possessions, was acquired. Then we acquired Oregon, then California, and New Mexico. We have enough now for the present, but this is a young and growing nation. It swarms as often as a hive of bees, and as new swarms are turned out each year, there must be hives in which they can gather and make their honey. In less than 15 years, if the same progress that has distinguished this country for the last 15 years continues, every foot of vacant land between this and the Pacific Ocean, owned by the United States, will be occupied. Will you not continue to increase at the end of 15 years as well as now? I tell you, increase and multiply and expand is the law of this nation's existence. You cannot limit this great republic by mere boundary lines, saying, "Thus far shalt thou go and no further." Any one of you, gentlemen, might as well say to a son 12 years old that he is big enough and must not grow any larger, and in order to prevent his growth, put a hoop around him to keep him to his present size. What would be the result? Either the hoop must burst and be rent asunder, or the child must die. So it would be with this great nation. With our natural increase, growing with a rapidity unknown in any other part of the globe, with the tide of emigration that is fleeing from despotism in the Old World to seek a refuge in our own, there is a constant torrent pouring into this country that requires more land, more territory upon which to settle, and just as fast as our interests and our destiny require additional territory in the north, in the south, or on the islands of the ocean, I am for it. And when we acquire it, we'll leave the people, according to the Nebraska bill, free to do as they please on the subject of slavery and every other question. I trust now that Mr. Lincoln will deem himself answered on his 4 points. He racked his brain so much in devising these 4 questions that he exhausted himself and had not strength enough to invent the others. As soon as he is able to hold a council with his advisers, Lovejoy, Farnsworth, and Fred Douglass, he will frame and propound others.
From the crowd came "Good, good," and laughter, in which Mr. Lincoln feebly joined, saying that he hoped with their aid to get 7 questions, the number asked him by Judge Douglas, and so make conclusions even.
You black Republicans who say "good," I have no doubt that they think that they're all good men. I have reason to recollect that some people in this country think that Fred Douglass is a very good man. The last time I came here to make a speech, while talking from the stand to you, people of Freeport, as I am doing today, I saw a carriage, and a magnificent one it was, drive up and take a position on the outside of the crowd. A beautiful young lady was sitting on the box seat, whilst Fred Douglass and her mother reclined inside, and the owner of the carriage acted as a driver. I saw this in your own town. All I have to say of it is this, that if you black Republicans think that the Negro ought to be on a social equality with your wives and daughters and ride in a carriage with your wife whilst you drive the team, you have a perfect right to do so. I am told that one of Fred Douglass's kinsmen, another rich black Negro, is now traveling in this part of the state, making speeches for his friend Lincoln as the champion of black men. All I have to say on that subject is that those of you who believe that the Negro is your equal and ought to be on an equality with you, socially, politically, and legally, have a right to entertain those opinions. And, of course, will vote for Mr. Lincoln. I have a word to say on Mr. Lincoln's answer to the interrogatories contained in my speech at Ottawa, and which he has pretended to reply to here today. Mr. Lincoln makes a great parade of the fact that I quoted a platform as having been adopted by the Black Republican Party at Springfield in 1854, which, it turns out, was adopted at another place. Mr. Lincoln loses sight of the thing itself in his ecstasies over the mistake I made in stating the place where it was done. He thinks that the platform was not adopted on the right spot. When I put the direct questions to Mr. Lincoln to ascertain whether he now stands pledged to that creed, to the unconditional repeal of the fugitive slave law, a refusal to admit any more slave states into the Union even if the people want them, a determination to apply the will not proviso not only to all the territory we now have, but all that we may hereafter acquire, he refused to answer, and his followers say in excuse that the resolutions upon which I based my interrogatories were not adopted at the right spot. Lincoln and his political friends are great on spots. In Congress, as a representative of this state, he declared the Mexican War to be unjust and infamous and would not support it or acknowledge his own country to be right in the contest because he said that American blood was not shed on American soil in the right spot. And now he cannot answer the questions I put to him at Ottawa because the resolutions I read were not adopted at the right spot. It may be possible that I was led into an error as to the spot on which the resolutions I then read were proclaimed, but I was not and am not in error as to the fact of their forming the basis of the creed of the Republican Party when that party was first organized. I will state to you the evidence I had and upon which I relied for my statement that the resolutions in question were adopted at Springfield on the 5th of October, 1854, although I was aware that such resolutions had been passed in this district and nearly all the northern congressional districts and county conventions. I had not noticed whether or not they had been adopted by any state convention. In 1856, a debate arose in Congress between Major Thomas L. Harris of the Springfield District and Mr. Norton of the Joliet District on political matters connected with our state, in the course of which Major Harris quoted those resolutions as having been passed by the first Republican state convention that ever assembled in Illinois. I knew that Major Harris was remarkable for his accuracy, that he was a very conscientious and sincere man, and I also noticed that Norton did not question the accuracy of this statement. I therefore took it for granted that it was so, and the other day, when I concluded to use the resolutions at Ottawa, I wrote to Charles H. Lamphere, editor of the State Register at Springfield, calling his attention to them, telling him that I had been informed that Major Harris was lying sick at Springfield, and desiring him to call upon him and ascertain all the facts concerning the resolutions. the time, and the place where they were adopted. In reply, Mr. Lamphere sent me 2 copies of his paper, which I have here. The first is a copy of the State Register published at Springfield, Mr. Lincoln's own town, on the 16th of October, 1854, only 11 days after the adjournment of the convention, from which I desire to read the following. During the late discussions in this city, Lincoln made a speech to which Judge Douglas replied. In Lincoln's speech, he took the broad ground that according to the Declaration of Independence, the whites and blacks are equal. From this, he drew the conclusion, which he several times repeated, that the white man had no right to pass laws for the government of the black man without the nigger's consent. This speech of Lincoln's was heard and applauded by all the abolitionists assembled in Springfield. So soon as Mr. Lincoln was done speaking, Mr. Codding arose and requested all of the delegates to the Black Republican Convention to withdraw into the Senate chamber. They did so, and after long deliberation, they laid down the following abolition platform as the platform on which they stood. We call the particular attention of all of our readers to it. Then follows the identical platform, word for word, which I read at Ottawa. Now, that was published in Mr. Lincoln's own town, 11 days after the convention was held, and it has remained on record up to this day, never contradicted. When I quoted the resolutions in Ottawa and questioned Mr. Lincoln in relation to them, he said that his name was on the committee that reported them, but he did not serve, nor did he think he served because he was, or thought he was, in Tazewell County at the time the convention was in session. He did not deny that the resolutions were passed by the Springfield Convention. He did not know better, and evidently thought they were. But afterwards, his friends declared that they had discovered that they varied in some respects from the resolutions passed by that convention. I have shown you that I had good evidence for believing that the resolutions had been passed at Springfield. Mr. Lincoln ought to have known better. But not a word is said about his ignorance on the subject, whilst I, notwithstanding the circumstances, am accused of forgery. Now, I will show you that if I have made a mistake as to the place where these resolutions were adopted, and when I get down to Springfield I will investigate the matter and see whether or not I have, that the principles they enunciate were adopted as the Black Republican platform in the various counties and congressional districts throughout the north end of the state in 1854. This platform was adopted in nearly every county that gave a Black Republican majority for the legislature in that year. And here is a man.
Here Douglas pointed to Mr. Denio, who sat on the stand near Deacon Bross,
who knows as well as any living man that it was the creed of the Black Republican Party at that time. I would be willing to call Denio as a witness, or any other honest man belonging to that party. I will now read the resolutions adopted at the Rockford Convention on the 30th of August, 1854, which nominated Washburn for Congress. You elected him on this platform. Resolved that the continued and increasing aggressions of slavery in our country are destructive of the best rights of a free people, and that such aggressions cannot be successfully resisted without the united political action of all good men. Resolved that the citizens of the United States hold in their hands peaceful, constitutional, and efficient remedy against the encroachments of the slave power, the ballot box, and if that remedy is boldly and wisely applied, the principles of liberty and eternal justice will be established. Resolved, that we accept this issue forced upon us by the slave power, and in defense of freedom will cooperate and be known as Republicans pledged to the accomplishment of the following purposes: to bring the administration of the government back to the control of first principles, to restore Kansas and Nebraska to the position of free territories, to repeal and entirely abrogate the fugitive slave law, to restrict slavery to those states in which it exists, to prohibit the admission of any more slave states into the Union, to exclude slavery from all the territories over which the general government has exclusive jurisdiction, and to resist the acquisition of any more territories unless the introduction of slavery therein forever shall have been prohibited. Resolved, that in furtherance of these principles, we will use such constitutional and lawful means as shall seem best adapted to their accomplishment, and that we will support no man for office under the general or state government who is not positively committed to the support of these principles, and whose personal character and conduct is not a guarantee that he is reliable, and shall abjure all party allegiance and ties. Resolved, that we cordially invite persons of all former political parties, whatever, in favor of the object expressed in the above resolutions, to unite with us in carrying them into effect.